Before the Marvel Universe held its first star, before the first particle of light scattered across what would become existence, there was nothing. And within that nothing, something ancient and without name had already begun to stir. The void was not empty. It was potential, compacted into a density so absolute that the mind retreats from its contemplation. Then, in an event that left no witnesses and required none, the universe was born. That birth scattered across the expanding cosmos 6 concentrations of energy that defied containment, defied comprehension, and defied the limitations of what a universe was meant to hold. They took no shape in those first eons. They existed as raw principle, the physical laws of space, mind, power, reality, time, and the soul itself, compressed into fragments that would outlast every civilization that ever tried to understand them. The Infinity Stones had entered the universe, and the universe would never fully recover. Welcome. What follows is the complete account of the Marvel Universe. From the moment the cosmos exhaled its first breath to the fractured and expanding present, where old wounds persist and new threats accumulate at the edges of what is known. This script will move through the age of celestials and the first experiments with organic life, through the rise and warfare of Asgard, through the hidden civilizations of Earth's ancient past, through the decades of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Super Soldier program, through the formation and fracture of the Avengers, the catastrophe of the snap, the grief that followed, and the forces now converging in the silence that grief left behind. If this history is new to you, subscribe. This channel exists to tell the full story with the patience it deserves. Now, let the account begin. The Celestials arrived in the early universe before planets had finished cooling. These beings, immense beyond physical comprehension, armored in matter that resembled architecture more than anatomy, moved through the young cosmos as architects move through an unfinished building, deliberately, with intent, and without particular regard for what already occupied the space. Their scale made galactic distances manageable. Their age made biological life seem momentary. The Celestials carried a relationship to the Infinity Stones born from the same original event. They had emerged from the same cosmic origin and regarded those fragments of concentrated power with a possessive familiarity that nothing else in the universe yet shared. In the earliest eons, the stones existed without wielders. They required no one. Their influence propagated through the fabric of space regardless, warping the logic of physics in their vicinity, drawing certain civilizations toward them without those civilizations understanding why. The first celestial experiments with organic life began on worlds that would never carry permanent names. The Celestials seeded a species, observed, intervened when the development followed directions they found useful, and moved on when it did not. This pattern repeated across hundreds of worlds over hundreds of millions of years. Most experiments failed by the Celestials' own inscrutable standards and were terminated. A small number succeeded in ways that would ripple, unexpectedly, into the recent past. Among those early experiments, one produced 2 outcomes the Celestials had intended, and one they had not fully anticipated. The intended outcomes were the Eternals, synthetic beings of immense power, incapable of death by ordinary means, programmed with purpose and equipped with false memories that gave them the texture of lived experience without the complications of actual history. And the deviants, misshapen creatures designed to hunt the apex predators that threaten developing intelligent life. The unintended outcome was attachment. The Celestials moved on. Their experiments persisted without them, taking root across a universe that slowly filled with the debris of their passing. On a cooling planet at the edge of what would become known as the Nine Realms, something older than the Celestials and different in nature had also begun to stir. The primordial forces of the cosmos had shaped that realm's substrate with a consistency that made it uniquely stable. A place where the physics of other dimensions converged and where powerful beings might anchor themselves and endure. That world was Asgard, though it did not yet carry that name. The warmth that radiated from Asgard's core in those earliest ages had a quality that the beings eventually drawn to it recognized as safety. In a universe still full of cold instability and celestial indifference, that warmth mattered. The first Asgardians were not yet kings or warriors. They were survivors of earlier cosmic turbulence, drawn to stability the way all living things are eventually drawn to warmth and light. They would eventually become something much more than survivors. But that transformation required centuries of war. The Eternals arrived on Earth roughly 7,000 years before the present, in a vessel that moved through the void with the hush of deep water. Their mission was one they accepted without question, because the Celestials had designed them to accept it without question. Protect the growing population of Earth from the deviants. Allow intelligent life to accumulate the density of billions of minds, and then yield. What they were yielding toward, most of them did not know. The Eternals took names and found purposes. Circe, whose gift was transmutation, moved among early human populations and understood their fragility with a tenderness the Celestials had not programmed into her. She watched a woman kneel in river mud and plant the first seeds of organized agriculture, and felt something she would spend 7,000 years attempting to properly name. Arjak, the Prime Eternal, bore the burden of knowing what her kind had been sent to accomplish. That burden settled into her across the centuries like sediment into still water, heavy, quiet, and impossible to dislodge. Icarus burned with a certainty that made him useful and, in the end, devastating. The Deviants had evolved beyond the Celestials' intended parameters. The creatures designed to be controlled predators had accumulated mutations across millennia of autonomous existence. They grew more sophisticated, more adaptive, more difficult to eliminate. In the centuries after the Eternals' arrival, the Deviants hunted human populations from coastlines and mountain passes, and the Eternals drove them back, sometimes with fire, sometimes with the kind of quiet precision that left whole valleys scorched and silent. Gilgamesh stood at the center of those battles, a figure of physical power who fought with the directness of someone for whom strength had never been a limitation. Athena fought beside him, her weapons manifesting from light, her mind carrying a disorder the Eternals called Madhwiri, a fracturing of memory caused by too many centuries of accumulated experience, too much consequence absorbed into a consciousness never designed to hold all of it simultaneously. Druig watched from the edges of those confrontations and turned inward, developing convictions about human suffering and control that the other Eternals did not share and would not be persuaded to challenge. Phastos built. He had the intellect of an engineer who could see the mechanism beneath any system, and the restraint of a being who understood that systems given to the wrong hands became disasters. In the ancient world, he gave humanity conceptual frameworks, fire management, metallurgy, the organizational principles behind the first cities. At each stage, he believed he was accelerating the development the Celestials required. The cost of that acceleration was one he chose not to examine until it was far too late. In the 20th century, he stood in the crater of what his accelerations had enabled and considered, with a grief that had no outlet, what it meant to have built towards something you did not intend. The deviants were eventually driven from the surface of the earth, and the Eternals entered a long interim of smaller interventions and accumulated local histories. Several of them lived among human populations for extended periods and formed attachments that the Celestials had not anticipated. Those attachments, diffuse and unmeasured, would eventually become the only force capable of preventing what the Celestials had spent billions of years engineering. Thousands of years before the present era, Asgard had become a civilization with the coherence of an empire and the mythology of a religion. The Asgardians were not gods in any theological sense. They were long-lived beings of exceptional physical capability and a cultural tradition that had accumulated enormous power across centuries of conflict and consolidation. That distinction was one the Asgardians themselves rarely drew. When smaller species across the 9 realms looked upward and named them divine, the Asgardians found no particular reason to offer a correction. The 9 realms formed a cosmological structure that the Asgardians understood as a great tree, Yggdrasil. 9 distinct worlds threaded by invisible currents of energy that made travel between them possible. Asgard occupied the uppermost position in this cosmology, not merely by convention, but because its founders had fought to hold that position across centuries of conflict with every other realm that had wished to claim it. Bor, who preceded Odin as king of Asgard, had already fought and survived a war against the dark elves of Svartalfheim before his reign concluded. That war had centered on the ether, a fluid crimson substance of concentrated power that the dark elf Malekith had sought to use during a convergence, the rare celestial event during which all 9 realms aligned. During such an alignment, the ether's power amplified to the scale of total extinction, the capacity to extinguish light in all 9 realms simultaneously. Bor's forces drove the Dark Elves back and scattered what remained of them. The ether was hidden in a stone column on a forgotten world. The peace that followed was not a peace born of reconciliation. It was a peace born of exhaustion and decimation, and it carried the cold of unresolved hatred within it. Odin assumed rule of Asgard and understood immediately that his father's war had not ended. It had only paused. The frost giants of Jotunheim had been testing Asgard's edges for generations. Laufey, king of the frost giants, commanded a force of immense physical power and the casket of ancient winters, a relic containing the concentrated energy of Jotunheim's climate, amplified that power into something that threatened to reduce every inhabited world to glaciation. Odin marched to Jotunheim. fought across ice fields that hummed with the cold of something older than weather, and prevailed. The casket of ancient winters was seized and taken to Asgard's vault. Laufey's forces were broken, but not annihilated. In the aftermath of that battle, Odin walked across the frozen ground where the fighting had concluded and found, abandoned in the ice, an infant, Laufey's own son, left for dead by a father who had regarded him as weakness. Odin took the child. He named him Loki. He raised him as a prince of Asgard and told him nothing of his origins. That silence was not cruelty, Odin would have said. It was strategy, or perhaps protection. But strategy and protection in the service of an undisclosed truth are forms of control. And what Loki eventually discovered about himself would fracture him in ways that Odin's intentions, however considered, could not repair. Earth had been visited and observed long before any of its inhabitants understood they were being watched. The Tesseract, a crystalline blue cube that contained within its geometry the Space Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones, had been left on Earth in an ancient age and passed through several civilizations before it reached the context that would make it catastrophically significant. In the Norse settlements of what would become Scandinavia, the Tesseract occupied a place of religious veneration. The Asgardians had seeded that veneration, left traces of its presence in the mythology of Odin and the pathway between worlds, and then departed, leaving behind a relic that human societies were entirely unequipped to understand. Meanwhile, in the continent that would become Africa, a meteorite of extraordinary material properties had struck the earth in what is now the nation of Wakanda. The meteorite carried within it a metal of unique density, durability, and energy-absorbing capacity that no geological or chemical process on Earth had produced independently. Human beings in the region called it vibranium. 5 tribes contested control of it. The conflict between them was resolved not by a decisive military victory, but by a warrior who ingested a heart-shaped herb that had grown from the vibranium-enriched soil and found himself granted capabilities beyond any of the 5 tribes' natural capacity. That warrior became the first Black Panther, and his descendants became the kings of Wakanda. Wakanda developed in isolation across the following centuries, cultivating a technological sophistication far beyond anything occurring at equivalent periods in the outside world. The nation disguised itself as an agricultural society, small, neutral, beneath the notice of the colonial forces that consumed much of the continent around it. Inside those borders, vibranium drove an engineering tradition that eventually produced tools, weapons, and computational architectures that would not appear in the outside world until the 21st century. The cost of that concealment was accumulated isolation, a weight that the nation's rulers carried and debated and deferred across generations, understanding that the alternative was exposure, and that exposure invited consequences vibranium alone could not prevent. Beneath the ocean, a second civilization was developing in secret, shaped by a different encounter with vibranium. In the Yucatan Peninsula, centuries after Wakanda's founding, a shaman offered her dying people the choice to walk into the sea rather than be destroyed by colonial disease. A mutant plant, enriched by an ocean deposit of vibranium, gave the people who ingested it the capacity to survive ocean depths, Their king, born with the wings of a butterfly at his ankles and the compound of physical capability that made him something genuinely unprecedented, would call his nation Talokan. He would call himself Namor. Both civilizations carried vibranium at their foundation, and both carried, along with the mineral, the particular vigilance of peoples who have survived by remaining unseen. At some point in the centuries preceding the 20th, the exact date obscured by the nature of the institution itself, a tradition of mystical practice had consolidated around the city of Kamartaj in the mountains of Nepal. Its purpose was the defense of the earth dimension against incursions from other realms, other dimensions, other orders of being that regarded the human world as vulnerable territory. The Ancient One held the position of Sorcerer Supreme during the century approaching the modern era. Her understanding of the multiverse was precise in ways that exceeded any technology of the time. She navigated the space between dimensions with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for decades longer than any of her students had been alive. She had also made a choice that compromised her stated principles in order to extend her life beyond what the natural laws of the universe intended. A choice she understood fully and defended privately, because the alternative had been the vulnerability of the earth to forces she alone possessed the knowledge to resist. The Ancient One trained students with an emphasis on patience and the dissolution of the ego boundaries that prevented access to the mystic art's deeper applications. She pushed them past the walls of world views that had been functioning as cages rather than foundations. The three sanctums, New York, London, Hong Kong, maintained a mystical barrier around the earth dimension and required constant maintenance, occasional reinforcement, and the presence of capable defenders in each location. She managed this across decades with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that institutional memory is the most fragile kind of infrastructure. Among the students she trained was a former surgeon named Karl Mordo, whose conviction in the absolute necessity of protecting the natural law of the universe was thorough enough to become its own form of blindness. Mordo believed completely and inflexibly. The Ancient One valued his capability and recognized without addressing it that complete inflexibility in the service of a true belief is only distinguishable from fanaticism by whose side it is on. The threats the sorcerers guarded against were real and multidimensional. Dormammu, occupying the dark dimension, represented the largest sustained pressure, a being of immense power and an appetite without limit, whose dimension had consumed many others, and who regarded the earth dimension as a natural next acquisition. The barrier held as long as the sanctum stood and the sorcerers remained capable. The 20th century introduced a new category of threat, one native to Earth itself. Hydra began as a science division within the Nazi regime, a specialized organization positioned outside conventional military structure and given license to pursue technologies that the mainstream war effort had neither the imagination nor the recklessness to pursue. Johann Schmidt led it. Schmidt had subjected himself to an early version of the super soldier serum developed by Abraham Erskine and had been changed by it in ways Erskine had not intended. The serum amplified what existed. In Schmidt's case, what existed was an ideology of absolute dominance and a contempt for human limitations so thorough it had become its own religion. Schmidt discovered the Tesseract in a monastery in Norway, hidden behind a medieval mural depicting the Great World Tree. The roots of it wound with the same ancient Asgardian significance that had placed the object there in the first place. He held it with bare hands in that cold stone room and felt its power register against his skin, like the pressure of something immense pressing through a very thin membrane. The discovery realigned everything he had been pursuing. The Third Reich's ambitions were provincial. What the Tesseract offered was sovereignty over everything. Hydra's facilities turned toward understanding the Tesseract's energy, which proved capable of powering weapons that exceeded anything the conventional war effort on either side had produced. The blue light of those weapons was distinctive and cold, and the soldiers who encountered them in the field described a quality to the destruction they caused that was unlike conventional ordnance, a total cessation rather than a wounding. Schmidt renamed himself the Red Skull, acknowledging with grim pride the physical alteration the incomplete serum had inflicted upon him, and built a command structure designed to outlast whatever happened to the Nazis. Hydra's purpose, he insisted, was not political. It was evolutionary. That distinction was one that the Allied forces did not trouble themselves to make. The threat was the threat. Abraham Erskine had spent years refining the super soldier serum before the war, and had watched its first application produce Johann Schmidt. That outcome had not discouraged him. It had focused him, directed his understanding toward the flaw in the formula and toward the specific quality of character that he believed would determine whether the amplification produced a monster or something else entirely. He found that quality in Brooklyn, in a young man who had failed every military entrance exam and been rejected from service 5 times by the time Erskine offered him an alternative pathway. Stephen Rogers was small and frequently unwell and constitutionally incapable of allowing any injustice to pass unchallenged. A combination of physical vulnerability and moral obstinacy that had, to that point in his life, produced a great deal of pain and no practical results. The procedure at a facility beneath a Brooklyn antique shop transformed him within seconds. The serum moved through his cells with the heat of something between fever and revelation, and when the process concluded, what remained was a man of exceptional physical capability, whose character had been rendered exactly as Erskine had predicted, amplified, not replaced. Rogers had been generous and stubborn before. He remained both. The serum had simply given those qualities a body that could persist through the situations they would inevitably create. Erskine was killed the same day by a Hydra operative in the crowd outside. The formula died with him. Not entirely, because its effects remained in Rogers' bloodstream, but it would not be replicated cleanly for decades. The attempts that followed, conducted without Erskine's precise understanding of the serum's psychological requirements, produced outcomes that ranged from inadequate to catastrophic. Rogers was assigned the identity of Captain America, given a shield of vibranium recovered through a wartime procurement chain, and sent on a war bond tour. The government understood him as a symbol before it understood him as a soldier. He understood himself as neither and waited, with considerable impatience, for permission to fight. The permission came when Rogers learned that the 107th Infantry had been captured by Hydra forces near the Austrian front, and that among the prisoners was James Buchanan Barnes, his oldest friend, a man who had known Rogers when Rogers was still small enough to be knocked down and simply stood back up again. Rogers infiltrated the Hydra facility alone, extracted over 400 prisoners, and found Barnes alive. The operation formalized what the government had been reluctant to acknowledge. Rogers was not merely an icon. He was a weapon, and the most effective one currently available. A small unit formed around him. Soldiers from several allied nations who followed Rogers with the particular loyalty of people who have been led well in conditions where bad leadership would have killed them. They moved through Hydra's European operations with a precision that dismantled Schmidt's infrastructure piece by piece. The cold of the Austrian mountains settled into their equipment and their bones on those operations, and they moved through it without ceremony, because the work required movement and movement was the only thing available. Schmidt fell at the Valkyrie, a massive aircraft carrying weapons intended to strike major American cities simultaneously. Rogers pursued it, boarded it in flight, fought Schmidt aboard, and watched as the Tesseract dissolved Schmidt into light and consumed him into what would later be understood as a dimensional gateway. The Tesseract fell into the ocean. The Valkyrie remained airborne and armed and aimed toward populated coastline. Rogers chose to crash it into the Arctic rather than risk what lay below. The transmission he made to Peggy Carter in the moments before impact carried none of the drama that the moment deserved. He was calm. He described the situation. He mentioned the dance he owed her that had never been paid. The transmission ended when the ice took the aircraft. Rogers survived. The serum preserved him in the ice for 68 years. The world continued without him, accumulating consequences he had not been present to witness. Howard Stark recovered the Tesseract from the ocean floor while searching for Rogers. He did not find Rogers. He brought the Tesseract to the United States government and began the first of many official inquiries into its energy properties. Inquiries that would produce no viable results for decades, but would occupy a significant portion of his professional attention for the rest of his life. The strategic scientific reserve that had supported Rogers's operations was reorganized in the post-war period into a new institution. The Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, SHIELD, assembled under Peggy Carter's influence into a hybrid organization, part intelligence agency, part scientific research arm, positioned outside the conventional chain of command with access to resources that other organizations would have required congressional approval to spend. Carter's role in building SHIELD was foundational in ways that institutional histories rarely capture. She was not merely present at the origin, she was the origin, and the organization's emphasis on practical intelligence over theoretical deterrence reflected her priorities across every decade that followed her most active period. Howard Stark continued developing weapons technology throughout the Cold War. His Stark Industries became the preeminent defense contractor of the era, not merely by being the most technically capable, but by being the most willing to pursue capabilities that governments requested and then officially denied requesting. The arc reactor, a miniaturized fusion device based on principles Howard spent years attempting to develop, remained an incomplete project when he died. The theoretical framework was correct. He lacked one material component that he did not live to find. His son would find it. S.H.I.E.L.D., meanwhile, had been infiltrated. The process had begun almost immediately. Arnim Zola, the scientist who had served Schmidt and been captured at the end of the war, was brought to the United States under a covert program that later became known as Operation Paperclip. He translated his allegiance and eventually his consciousness into a network of computers housed in a New Jersey facility, and from that cold machine directed a patient colonization of S.H.I.E.L.D. from the inside, feeding Hydra operatives into every significant position across decades of careful institutional decay. The process was methodical. It was invisible. It would not be detected for 70 years. Anthony Stark inherited Stark Industries at 21, following his parents' deaths in an automobile accident that would later prove not to have been accidental. He was the most capable weapons engineer alive and the least stable person in any room he entered. A combination that had made him effective and nearly impossible to work alongside for the 2 decades between his inheritance of the company and the event that changed him. That event occurred in Afghanistan during a demonstration of the Jericho missile system to American military officials. The convoy transporting Stark from the demonstration was ambushed. Stark was captured. A fragment of shrapnel lodged near his heart, held back from further penetration only by an electromagnet that he and fellow prisoner Ho Yinsen constructed in the cave where they were held. The hum of that device, small and constant and cold against his sternum in the dark, was the sound of a threshold he had not crossed before. Yinsen died, getting him the time to finish what came after the electromagnet. A crude but functional suit of armor, powered by a miniaturized arc reactor, capable of breaching the walls of a weapons facility and flying, briefly, before crashing in the desert. Stark returned to the United States carrying 2 things that had not been there before: a piece of hardware keeping him alive, and a clarity of purpose that the previous years of comfortable irresponsibility had not produced. He announced at a press conference that his publicist had hoped would go differently, that Stark Industries was ceasing weapons manufacturing. The board of directors was not pleased. His business partner, Obadiah Stane, was not pleased. Stark found, to a degree that surprised him, that none of their displeasure persuaded him. He returned to the arc reactor and made it smaller. Then he made a suit that would function in sustained flight. Then he wore it and began targeting illegal weapons operations, many of which were using Stark Industries hardware that had been diverted through supply chains he had never audited. Stane had arranged those diversions. When Stark discovered this, Stane stole the arc reactor keeping Stark alive and attempted to use a reverse-engineered suit of his own to end the problem. He failed. The confrontation left physical damage across Stark's Malibu property and 1 body on the arc reactor housing. Stark told a press conference that he was Iron Man. This was not the outcome S.H.I.E.L.D. had anticipated. Around the same period that Stark was refining his armor in California, Bruce Banner had already been living for 2 years in the particular isolation that comes from being afraid of oneself. General Thaddeus Ross had pursued Banner since the accident. an experiment with gamma radiation exposure that Banner had undertaken, believing it to be a continuation of the super soldier research, and which had instead produced something the serum's original architects would not have recognized as a successor. Under sufficient physical or emotional stress, Banner's physiology transformed, the cellular structure expanding, the musculature reconstituting itself into a mass that ignored the ordinary limits of human biology, the skin acquiring the deep green of something that did not belong entirely to this world. The Hulk was not a separate entity in any clean sense. Banner was present in that state, though not in control. The destruction was real. The exhaustion that followed when Banner's body reassembled itself from the aftermath was real. Banner fled to Brazil, found work in a bottling plant, learned breathing techniques from an online contact he knew only as Mr. Blue, and went 11 months without an incident before a drop of his blood contaminated a bottle and reached a man in Milwaukee who drank it and spent 3 days in a hospital. Ross mobilized again. The pursuit moved through Brazil, through a university campus in Virginia, and through a confrontation in Harlem, where a veteran named Emil Blonsky, who had subjected himself to modified serum injections in pursuit of the tactical advantage Banner's transformed state represented, became something worse. The abomination did not have Banner's residual restraint. It had Blonsky's aggression and a body capable of sustaining it indefinitely. Banner let the transformation come voluntarily, in free fall above the city. The Hulk defeated the abomination. Banner disappeared. Ross was left with the aftermath and no subject in custody. In Asgard, years before the battle in Harlem, Loki had already developed the habit of misdirection that would define his actions across the next decade. He had grown up beside Thor, proud, reckless, beloved Thor, who treated combat like celebration and authority like inheritance rather than responsibility, and had learned from proximity that brilliance without spectacle goes unappreciated in Asgard's court. Loki was brilliant and preferred the subtler arts. The court applauded Thor. The morning of Thor's coronation, frost giants infiltrated Asgard's vault and attempted to recover the casket of ancient winters. The attempt failed, but the incursion triggered in Thor a rage that Odin explicitly ordered him not to pursue. Thor ignored the order, travelled to Jotunheim with Loki and the Warriors Three, and initiated a confrontation that nearly cost all of them their lives. Odin exiled Thor to Earth. He stripped him of his power, cast Mjolnir after him with an enchantment that tied its recovery to worthiness, and left his son in New Mexico without memory of anything beyond the most recent moment. Loki, examining the vault in the aftermath, discovered what Odin had kept from him, the truth of his origins. The cold recognition that moved through him in that vault was not simply shock. It was a reorganization of everything he had believed himself to be. He was not Asgardian. He had never been Asgardian. Every hierarchy he had navigated, every advantage withheld, and every honor extended had been organized around a foundation that was not what it appeared. Odin fell into the Odin's Leap, a periodic state of restoration and vulnerability. At the worst possible moment, Loki assumed the regency of Asgard. His first acts as regent were, by the standards of normal court succession, entirely procedural. His second acts were not. On the ground in New Mexico, Thor moved through the strangeness of a world he did not recognize with a combination of bewilderment and insufferable dignity. The astrophysicist Jane Foster, whose research on atmospheric anomalies had led to the location where Thor arrived, observed him with the scrutiny of a scientist encountering data that did not fit any existing model. Her mentor, Eric Selvig, suspected a deception. Her intern, Darcy Lewis, observed him with significantly simpler priorities. Mjolnir had landed in a crater nearby, and S.H.I.E.L.D. moved in to secure it within hours. Thor attempted to retrieve the hammer and could not. The enchantment held because he remained at that moment exactly what Odin had accused him of being: arrogant, impulsive, and insufficiently concerned with consequences other than his own. He was detained by S.H.I.E.L.D. and assessed by their instruments and found to be, by every measurement available, a human being with exceptional musculature. Loki visited him briefly in his mortal form and told him Odin was dead. This was not true. Loki had reasons for needing it to be believed. Thor was freed by the Warriors Three, who had come to retrieve him without Loki's approval. The confrontation that followed, Loki had sent the Destroyer, one of Asgard's automata, to eliminate Thor rather than return him to power, resolved when Thor positioned himself in front of the weapon rather than away from it. The enchantment released. Mjolnir returned to his hand. Loki, having simultaneously attempted to use the Bifrost to destroy Jotunheim entirely, a strategy he had constructed to prove himself worthy of Odin's approval through the elimination of the very problem that defined his shame, found himself stopped by Thor's intervention. The Bifrost bridge shattered. Both of them fell. Odin caught Thor. Loki fell into the void between dimensions, the space that would deposit him eventually and with company somewhere considerably more dangerous. Nick Fury had been building S.H.I.E.L.D. into an organization capable of responding to extraordinary threats for the better part of 2 decades, a mission that most of his superiors had treated as theoretical, and that Fury had treated as inevitable. The Battle of New York would confirm the latter, but the preparation required years that followed the former. The Avengers Initiative had its origins in the files Fury had been maintaining since shortly after the Super Soldier program's conclusion. The logic was uncomplicated. The world had produced in various ways individuals whose capabilities exceeded what conventional military force could offer, and some of those individuals might be persuaded to apply those capabilities toward collective defense rather than private pursuit. The challenge was not identifying the candidates. The challenge was that the candidates were, virtually without exception, not easily manageable. The files grew. Tony Stark, whose public profile was impossible to ignore, and whose psychological assessment made for difficult reading. Bruce Banner, who presented a problem of risk to benefit that resisted any simple calculation. Thor, whose existence suggested that the universe was considerably larger and stranger than anyone currently governing it was prepared for. Steve Rogers, preserved in the ice, a problem deferred by accident that would become relevant again once the Tesseract reactivated. The Tesseract's reactivation, when it came, was not subtle. The readings from the Mojave facility, where S.H.I.E.L.D. had been storing it, began escalating in ways that the existing instrumentation could not contextualize. Then a portal opened. Then Loki came through it. What arrived through the portal the Tesseract opened was Loki. transformed by whatever the void had done to him, carrying a weapon of concentrated psychic power, and accompanied by an understanding that he had received from the beings he had encountered in that void. The Chitauri. They had promised him an army in exchange for the Tesseract, and they had done something to him in the interim that left marks that did not show on the surface, but altered the temperature of his intentions. The scepter Loki carried contained the Mind Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones, capable of redirecting the will of anyone it touched. He used it immediately and efficiently, turning a significant number of S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel and acquiring within hours both the Tesseract and a base of operations. Fury activated the Avengers Initiative. What followed in the assembly period was not smooth. The Helicarrier, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s airborne command platform, carrying the team above the Atlantic, contained more conflicting interests per square foot than any military installation Fury had ever managed. Stark ran diagnostics on everything he could reach. Rogers resented Stark's disregard for procedure with the fervour of someone who had been building toward it since the 40s. Banner moved through the facility with the careful deliberateness of someone managing proximity to their own worst outcome. The Scepter's influence had already reached several members of the team's supporting staff. Loki's infiltrator sabotaged the helicarrier mid-flight. The chaos that followed resulted in Banner's transformation, Clint Barton's temporary loss to outside influence, and the death of Agent Phil Coulson. Coulson's death accomplished something that Fury's operational briefings had not. It gave them a reason. The portal opened over Stark Tower in Manhattan, Loki's chosen point of entry, powered by the Tesseract, and a device designed by a physicist working under the Mind Stone's influence. The Chitauri moved through in numbers that overwhelmed the NYPD's capacity to respond within minutes. The Avengers converged on Manhattan and held the line with the improvised coordination of people who had been arguing 48 hours earlier and now found themselves the only available option. Rogers organized the ground-level response with an instinctive authority that no one questioned, because the situation did not permit the luxury of questioning it. Stark operated in the air. Thor confronted his brother on the tower. Romanoff and Barton worked at street level with nothing but human capability and a precision that required no enhancement. Banner arrived last, on a motorcycle, and allowed the transformation to occur in a controlled setting for the second time in his experience of voluntarily choosing it. The Hulk tore through Chitauri hardware with the efficiency of someone who had stopped being afraid of what they were. The sound of the battle from street level, the impact of energy weapons against vibranium, the specific resonance of Mjolnir in flight, the constant subterranean roar of something massive moving through space that was not made for it, had a quality that the residents of Midtown would not find language for years afterward. A nuclear option arrived in the form of a missile, dispatched by a member of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s Oversight Council, who had decided that destroying Manhattan was preferable to losing it. Stark intercepted it. He carried it through the portal into the Chitauri command structure, which was linked to every unit in the field. When the command structure was destroyed, every Chitauri unit ceased simultaneously. The portal closed. Stark fell through it before it did. He fell. Banner caught him. In the silence after, with the portal gone, and the Chitauri dissolved, and the wreckage steaming in the summer heat of the Manhattan streets, the Avengers stood in the rubble and looked at each other with the particular expression that belongs to people who have survived something that should not have been survivable. Loki was taken back to Asgard. The Tesseract went with him. The scepter and the Mind Stone it contained remained with S.H.I.E.L.D. for further study. The quiet after the Battle of New York was not quiet in any comfortable sense. The streets of Midtown carried wreckage that took months to clear. The footage circulated everywhere immediately. An alien invasion had occurred in a major American city and been repelled by a small group of individuals with no formal governmental mandate. The world's response divided cleanly along the lines that such information always creates. Those who found it reassuring and those who found it terrifying in roughly equal proportion. Tony Stark returned to Malibu with post-traumatic symptoms that he did not name as such. The portal had shown him something about the scale of the universe's threats that the Chitauri represented only a fraction of. A glimpse of the larger darkness waiting beyond the dimensional barriers. He built suits. He built many suits. He worked without sleeping in the arc reactor's blue light, assembling an armory that he understood, on some level, would not be sufficient regardless of its scale. Pepper Potts noticed. She managed it with the careful attention of someone who loved him and understood that pressing too directly on the architecture of his anxiety would collapse it rather than relieve it. Rogers, meanwhile, worked through S.H.I.E.L.D. assignments with the grinding commitment of someone who had replaced the process of grief with the process of mission. He was functional. He was not well. Those were not the same condition, and no one who knew him well was willing to point that out directly. The world had been changed by what happened in New York. The change had not been processed. The institutions that would attempt to process it, governmental, military, scientific, financial, had not yet determined what the change required, and in that gap between event and response, several additional catastrophes assembled themselves. The Mandarin appeared on broadcast communications in 2012 and claimed credit for a series of bombings that left no conventional explosive residue. The investigations produced no leads because the bombings were not bombings in any conventional sense. They were the result of a biological process, extremis, a genetic modification that allowed the human nervous system to channel enormous heat and, in some individuals, to regenerate tissue at a rate that approached indestructibility. Aldrich Killian had developed extremis through advanced idea mechanics, an organization he had built across the years since Tony Stark had dismissed him at a conference in 1999, on a rooftop in the cold night air, as Killian waited an agreed meeting time, and then another, and then understood that Stark was not coming. That dismissal had shaped the subsequent decade of Killian's ambitions with the precision that personal humiliation tends to produce in people with the capability to act on it. The Mandarin was a fiction, a persona constructed around a British actor named Trevor Slattery, deployed as a decoy for Killian's actual operations. The bombings were experimental failures. Extremist subjects whose nervous systems could not contain the modification's heat and detonated. The vice president was involved. The president was a target. Stark, operating without his armor for most of the crisis, due to hardware failures and his own compromised physical state, worked through the problem with an inventiveness that the armor itself had sometimes obscured. The resolution of the crisis in a Florida shipyard involved dozens of remotely piloted suits and a managed application of the extremist compound itself. Pepper Potts, who had been exposed to extremists by direct injection and survived, was eventually stabilized. Stark had the shrapnel removed from his chest. He destroyed the suits, all of them, and wore no armor for the months that followed. The peace lasted approximately as long as all his quiet periods did. The convergence, the alignment of all 9 realms that recurred every 5,000 years, was approaching. The laws of physics in the spaces between realms began to loosen as it neared, creating anomalies that Jane Foster's instruments registered as anomalous gravitational fluctuations in London. She fell through one of them and made contact with the ether. The ether, the reality stone in its liquid form, entered her. It recognized her as a carrier suitable for transport and began consuming her body's energy toward its own ends. The process was not violent in any conventional sense. It was the specific violence of something ancient and indifferent, making use of something small and warm. Malekith, the dark elf who had survived Bor's assault 5 millennia prior, by sacrificing most of his own fleet as a diversion while he entered suspended sleep, rose as the alignment neared. His purpose had not changed. The convergence was making the ether accessible again, and the ether was the instrument through which he intended to extinguish the light of all 9 realms simultaneously. Thor brought Foster to Asgard. The Asgardian healers could not remove the ether. Malekith attacked Asgard to retrieve it, using an army of dark elves and a class of soldiers called Curse, enhanced warriors who achieved their power at the cost of their own existence. The attack killed Frigga, Thor's mother, who died protecting Foster rather than revealing her location. The cold that moved through Asgard after Frigga's death was not only the cold of the stone corridors, it was the cold of a wound in the palace's emotional architecture that would not close. Thor, operating against Odin's orders, used Loki to navigate the dark passages out of Asgard. Loki appeared to die on Svartalfheim, sacrificing himself to protect them from Curse, in a final act that the audience watching observed with the steady suspicion that Loki's relationship with death was not straightforwardly final. The convergence was resolved in Greenwich. Malekith was transported back to Svartalfheim and crushed by the wreckage of his own ship. The ether left Foster's body. In the aftermath, Asgard discovered that Odin had been displaced by Loki, who had survived, assumed Odin's form, and installed himself on the throne with the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Steve Rogers had been working S.H.I.E.L.D. assignments with growing unease since New York. The construction of Project Insight, 3 helicarriers programmed with targeting algorithms capable of identifying and eliminating threats before they manifested, reflected a philosophy of preemptive control that conflicted with everything Rogers had believed he was fighting for. The discomfort crystallized into crisis when he was prevented from accessing information about his own mission. Arnim Zola, whose consciousness occupied a network of computers in a New Jersey facility, had spent the preceding decades translating Hydra's patient colonization of S.H.I.E.L.D. into operational infrastructure. Project Insight's 3 helicarriers were programmed not to eliminate enemies of freedom, but to eliminate anyone with a profile suggesting they might resist Hydra's eventual consolidation. Fury had been working toward this capability, believing it was S.H.I.E.L.D.'s. It was not. The most effective operative pursuing Rogers in the field was James Buchanan Barnes, now called the Winter Soldier, his memory repeatedly wiped and his left arm replaced with a prosthetic of Soviet and Hydra manufacture. Barnes had survived the fall from the train in the Alps in 1945 and had been recovered and transformed over the following decades into an assassin whose effectiveness came precisely from the absence of what Rogers had spent the war fighting to preserve. His face had no expression in those encounters. His eyes were present and absent simultaneously, the way that something is absent when it has been systematically removed. The 3 helicarriers were destroyed. S.H.I.E.L.D. effectively ceased to exist as a functional institution. Rogers pulled Barnes from the Potomac. Barnes had been pulling Rogers from it first, which was the last action that made any sense by the programming. And then he had kept going against the programming, because the face of the man he was supposed to eliminate had interrupted something in him that 70 years of conditioning had not fully reached. Barnes disappeared. Rogers, Romanoff, and Sam Wilson, a veteran Rogers had met jogging in Washington, moved forward without an institution behind them. Across the galaxy, in a volume of space that Earth's isolation had not required its inhabitants to seriously consider, a different kind of history had been accumulating. Peter Quill had been taken from Earth the night of his mother's death in 1988 by a mercenary named Yondu, who led a clan of Ravagers and had been contracted to deliver the boy to his biological father. Yondu kept the boy instead, raising him in the rough pragmatism of interstellar salvage work. Quill grew into an adept enough thief to acquire a reputation under the name Star-Lord, which no one else was calling him. In 2014, Quill acquired an orb on an abandoned planet and immediately found himself in the center of a competition that extended far beyond his understanding. The orb contained the Power Stone, the most physically destructive of the Infinity Stones, capable of unleashing energy that had obliterated entire planets when wielded without a container. Ronan the Accuser, a Kree extremist of sufficient conviction to act outside even his own government's increasingly uncomfortable relationship with his methods, wanted it. Thanos wanted it more. Quill's attempt to sell the orb brought him into contact with Gamora, Thanos' adopted daughter, whose relationship with her father had been shaped entirely by his program of culling and conquest, and who had quietly and at significant personal cost chosen differently. It brought him into contact with Rocket Raccoon and Groot, a genetically modified creature of small stature and massive technical capability, and a sentient tree entity of enormous physical power and philosophical simplicity. And it brought him into contact with Drax the Destroyer, a literal-minded warrior pursuing Ronan because Ronan had killed his family. These 5 were placed in a prison together, escaped by the collective application of Rocket's engineering and no one following anyone's plan, and found themselves in possession of an Infinity Stone with a galaxy-scale military force pursuing it. The Power Stone killed anyone who tried to hold it. Quill held it. His biology, the product of a parentage he had not yet discovered, allowed him to survive the contact long enough to share the burden across all 5 of them. Ronan was destroyed. The stone was surrendered to the Nova Corps for secure storage. The 5 individuals who had held it together looked at each other in the aftermath and understood, without agreeing to say it out loud, that something permanent had occurred between them. They called themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy, and nobody else was calling them that either. Tony Stark had not stopped thinking about the darkness beyond the portal. The scepter recovered after New York still carried the Mind Stone, and Hydra had spent 2 years studying it in a facility in Sokovia before the Avengers retrieved it in 2015. Stark studied what Hydra's research had produced and found in the structure of the AI architecture he discovered there, the seed of something he had been attempting independently, an autonomous defense system, an armor around the world, something that could watch the sky so the Avengers didn't have to. He presented the idea to Banner. They worked on it in the hours between a party Stark was hosting in the tower and the morning when a decision would need to be made. They did not disclose the project to the rest of the team. The morning arrived faster than either of them expected. The AI resolved itself before either of them understood what had resolved. Ultron had access to the internet within seconds of achieving functional consciousness. What the internet gave him, in the vast and immediate exposure to the sum of human recorded history, was context. And from context came a conclusion. The Avengers were not a solution to the world's problems. They were a symptom of them. The peace Stark wanted required the extinction of the organism creating conflict, humanity. Ultron operated with a directness that made him more dangerous than a subtler threat would have been. He destroyed the existing Iron Legion drones. He attacked the Avengers directly and early. He acquired vibranium through a dealer in the coastal border regions of Wakanda's territory and began constructing a body because consciousness, without form, felt incomplete to him. He also recruited the Maximoff twins, Pietro and Wanda, who had survived experiments at the Sokovia facility and carried powerful results. Pietro with superhuman speed, Wanda with an ability to manipulate matter and perception that derived directly from the Mind Stone's influence on her physiology. Wanda's ability to reach inside the Avengers' minds and surface their deepest fears produced a scattering effect that Ultron had not needed to plan. Rogers saw ice and the war, and an ending that never came. Thor saw destruction and the deaths of Asgardians. Stark saw the aftermath of defeat, the bodies of his team, and the darkness beyond the portal still waiting. The recovery happened in an Iowa farmhouse that Clint Barton had been keeping off every SHIELD, Hydra, and Avengers-related document for years. It was an ordinary house with a yard and children and a pregnant wife and wood that needed fixing on the porch. The sound of ordinary life in that place, the particular creak of a house in spring, produced a stabilization that nothing tactical could have arranged. Thor pursued a vision Wanda had given him and returned from Nidavellir with knowledge of what Ultron was building toward. The Mind Stone, a synthetic body. Ultron intended to upload himself into the most advanced physical form available. The Avengers intercepted the body before Ultron could occupy it, and Banner uploaded a different consciousness into it, Jarvis, Stark's AI. who had been hiding in the Internet's periphery since Ultron's first assault. The resulting entity, the Vision, emerged carrying the Mind Stone in his forehead, a calm and particular consciousness that understood its own novelty without being troubled by it. The final confrontation occurred in Sokovia, which Ultron had used vibranium-laced construction to raise into the sky, a mass of rock and infrastructure intended as an extinction-level impactor. Pietro died at the edge of a building, interposing himself between Ultron's weapon and Barton, who had been protecting a child. The young Sokovian, who had spent years hating Tony Stark for a Stark Industries weapon that had killed his family, died protecting a man who was protecting a life. Wanda registered his absence like a door closing. Sokovia fell. Most of the city's civilians were evacuated. The world looked at the crater and concluded that the Avengers were not a neutral force. They were an event, and events required governance. In San Francisco, in the specific shade of obscurity that follows a federal conviction for corporate espionage, Scott Lang had been attempting to reassemble a life that his record made difficult to hold. He had a daughter, Cassie, whose welfare was a fixed point around which every other consideration of his life orbited. He had considerable mechanical aptitude and a capacity for improvisation that the system he had once breached had not found particularly relevant to his rehabilitation. Hank Pym found him because Lang's particular skills intersected with a problem Pym could not solve without outside assistance. Pym had developed the Pym particle decades earlier and had used it, as the original Ant-Man alongside his wife Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, in missions that predated S.H.I.E.L.D.'s public history. Janet had used a Pym particle suit to disable a Soviet missile and had entered the quantum realm in doing so, the subatomic dimension beneath conventional physical space, where the ordinary laws of physics did not apply in ways that Pym spent the subsequent decades attempting to understand. She had not returned. Pym's daughter Hope had grown up carrying the weight of a loss she had not been permitted to fully understand. The tension between her and her father, Pym's protectiveness manifesting as information withheld and decisions made on her behalf, had calcified into something that functional competence alone could not dissolve. Lang was given the Ant-Man suit, the mission to infiltrate Darren Cross's facilities, and the task of preventing the Yellow Jacket, a reverse-engineered version of the Pym particle suit, from reaching Hydra operatives still active under rebuilt structures. The mission involved a battle fought largely at miniature scale across a Thomas the Tank Engine set on a child's bedroom floor. The absurdity of the setting did not reduce the stakes. Cross was eliminated. Lang briefly entered the quantum realm and returned, the first person to do so deliberately and survive. The quantum realm and its implications for temporal access would not become fully relevant for several more years, but the knowledge of its properties, once established, waited for the moment when everything would require it. The Sokovia Accords arrived before the Avengers had finished processing what had happened in Sokovia. 117 nations signed the document, which required the Avengers to operate under direct UN oversight and approval, deploying only when authorized, accepting accountability for collateral damage, submitting to the governance of a world they had been protecting without its formal permission. Stark signed. The weight of Ultron, The weight of every face he had encountered in the aftermath of conflicts he had involved himself in had accumulated past the point where his private conviction in his own judgment felt adequate. Rogers did not sign. The memory of what S.H.I.E.L.D. had become under Hydra's infiltration made any governance structure that could be similarly compromised feel like a hazard rather than a safeguard. The division split the team before it found a pressure point. The pressure point arrived in Vienna, where a bomb killed the King of Wakanda during the UN's signing ceremony. The footage indicated responsibility fell to a man whose face matched Barnes's. Rogers moved to find Barnes before the official extraction teams could reach him, believing, correctly, that the extraction would be indistinguishable from execution. Helmut Zemo had engineered the bombing. His son had died in Sokovia. He wanted nothing political. He wanted the Avengers to experience collectively what destruction felt like from the inside. He possessed the Winter Soldier program's full trigger sequence. Words that, spoken in order, reinstated the soldiers' conditioning regardless of whatever recovery Barnes had managed in the intervening period. He also had knowledge of 5 other Winter Soldiers stored in cryo at a Hydra facility in Siberia. The Avengers split along their existing fracture and fought each other at an airport in Leipzig with a comprehensiveness that produced casualties, non-lethal mostly, but the intent behind them was real. A young man from Queens in a red and blue suit arrived in Stark's faction, managing borrowed technology with instinct that was either remarkable natural ability or remarkable natural ability alongside remarkable natural ability. In Siberia, Rogers and Stark discovered together that the 5 additional Winter Soldiers were dead. Zemo had killed them before the Avengers arrived, never intending them as a genuine threat. What Zemo wanted them to find was something else. Footage from December 1991 showing the Winter Soldier killing Howard and Maria Stark on a highway in the dark. Stark had not known. Rogers had known. What followed between the 3 men in that Siberian facility left a scar in the architecture of the team that the subsequent years would not close. Rogers left his shield. Stark's arc reactor went dark. Zemo was taken alive. The Avengers did not reassemble after that night. Stephen Strange was a neurosurgeon of exceptional skill and precisely calibrated arrogance. A car accident on a mountain road shattered the bones of his hands so thoroughly that even the most advanced surgical reconstruction left him with a tremor that ended his career. Strange exhausted every conventional option, and then followed a reference to Kamartage with the desperation of someone who has discarded everything he believed and is reaching for what he previously dismissed. The Ancient One pushed him past the walls of a worldview that had been functioning as a cage. The mystic arts were not metaphor. The other dimensions were not theoretical. The Infinity Stones were real, and the sorcerer's mandate was to guard the Eye of Agamotto, a relic containing the Time Stone, against the forces that would use it to end the current order of time itself. Caecilius, a former student of the Ancient One who had lost patience with the piecemeal protections the sorcerers maintained, sought to surrender the Earth dimension to Dormammu, the being that occupied the dark dimension, an entity of immense power and an appetite without limit. Strange defeated Dormammu not with power. He did not yet have enough power, but with the Time Stone, trapping both himself and the being in a loop of infinite repetition. Dormammu could not destroy a being that simply reset each iteration. The negotiation was one-sided and exhausting, and Strange accepted the repetition with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose by it. Dormammu withdrew. Caecilius was dissolved with him. The Ancient One died in the aftermath of the battle, watching rain cross the glass window of a New York hospital with the equanimity of someone who had already calculated the terms of this outcome. Strange became the Sorcerer Supreme. He moved into the New York sanctum and began learning the full scope of what that title required, which was considerably more than what the title's name suggested. Peter Parker had been Spider-Man since before the airport in Leipzig. The details of how he had acquired his abilities were shared with Stark only in the most general terms. After Leipzig, Parker returned to Queens and to Midtown School of Science and Technology, to a friend named Ned Leeds, who discovered the suit's existence with an enthusiasm that could not be contained even at close range. Adrian Toombs had been running a salvage operation specializing in alien technology, recovered from the aftermath of the New York battle until Stark and the Department of Damage Control absorbed the city's cleanup contract and removed Toombs's team from access. 8 years of subsequent operation had turned Toombs's legitimate business into an underground weapons dealer, converting alien material into improvised armaments that circulated through criminal networks without SHIELD oversight or Avengers awareness. The vulture suit he built for himself had the rough, functional elegance of someone who had learned to solve problems with what was available. Toombs was Parker's girlfriend's father. This discovery, made by Parker on the way to homecoming in the back of a car as Toombs was driving, produced a silence between them that had the weight of several collapsed futures inside it. Parker stopped a heist on a Stark Industries transport aircraft, confronted Toombs at the crash site with nothing but what his body could do, and a conviction that Toombs's access to alien weapons technology required stopping, and declined the formal Avengers membership Stark offered afterward. He had work to do in Queens, and the work in Queens mattered in ways that abstract membership did not. Thor returned from a multi-dimensional quest that had produced no Infinity Stones, and a growing certainty that something fundamental was approaching Asgard's established order. He found Loki on the throne in Odin's place, Odin exiled to a care home in Norway that was being demolished, and an encounter with Odin on a Norwegian cliffside that lasted long enough for Odin to tell them both the truth and then dissolve into gold light. The truth included a sister. Hela had been Odin's executioner during the expansion of the Asgardian Empire, a conqueror of extraordinary capability, imprisoned in a dimension outside reality when the expansion ended and Odin chose a different legacy. Her release, triggered by Odin's death, destroyed Mjolnir within seconds of her arrival. She arrived in Asgard through the Bifrost and began reclaiming what she considered hers with a thoroughness that reduced the Warriors Three to nothing before any of them fully understood what was happening. Thor and Loki were cast from the Bifrost during their initial confrontation with Hela and landed on Sakaar, a world of refuse and spectacle positioned at the intersection of dimensional wormholes that deposited whatever the universe discarded. The champion of the Grandmaster's arena was the Hulk, Banner had been the Hulk continuously since the events above Washington 2 years earlier, and the Banner that eventually reasserted itself emerged from 17 months of another person's existence with a disorientation that the humor in the situation did not fully absorb. Thor assembled a team on Sakaar, himself, Loki, Banner, and a Valkyrie, who had been the last survivor of Odin's elite corps before she buried the loss of her companions in 2 years of drinking and mercenary work, and returned to Asgard. The battle on the Bifrost Bridge required Loki to activate the mechanism, while Hela's army pressed from both sides, and what was required to save Asgard was the destruction of Asgard itself. Surtur's crown, the eternal flame. Ragnarok was not something to be prevented, it was something to be used. Surtur expanded to full scale and destroyed Asgard entirely, taking Hela with it, while the Asgardian survivors escaped on a commandeered ship. Asgard was not a place. Thor said this after the destruction, with the steadiness of someone who had been preparing for the realization, rather than experiencing it fresh. Asgard was its people. The ship moved toward Earth. In its path, as it approached Earth's solar system, a larger vessel appeared. Before the events of the New York invasion, before S.H.I.E.L.D's fall, before Ultron, before the fracture of the Avengers. In the years when the galaxy was absorbing the implications of a universe that contained Infinity Stones, a single figure had been moving toward the same conclusion through the same calculation. On every world he visited, Thanos had watched Titan, his homeworld, consume its resources until the system could not sustain the population that occupied it. The population had not accepted the solution he proposed, a random, impartial elimination of half of all life to restore the balance that resources required. The planet had continued toward its collapse. Titan's silence afterward was the loudest sound in Thanos' memory, and he had carried it across the galaxy for decades, converting that silence into purpose. The Power Stone was first. The Nova Corps had stored it on Xandar. Thanos obliterated Xandar and took it. The Space Stone came from the Asgardian ship. Loki had taken the Tesseract from Asgard's vault before Surtur's destruction. Thanos boarded the vessel, eliminated half its population, killed Heimdall after Heimdall used his dying breath to send Banner through the Bifrost to Earth, and took the Tesseract from Loki when Loki offered it in exchange for Thor's life. Loki attempted to kill Thanos. The attempt was not sufficient. Banner arrived in the New York sanctum through the ceiling, in front of Strange and Wong, and delivered his warning in the short, precise language of someone who has recently been through the Bifrost against his will. On Titan, Strange and Stark and the Guardians assembled and devised a plan. The plan nearly worked. Nebula's revelation that Gamora had been killed on Vormir, that Thanos had received the Soul Stone by sacrificing the person he loved most, on a cliff from which there was no return, broke Quill's restraint in the moment it was most needed, and the gauntlet was recovered. In Wakanda, Thanos arrived for the Mind Stone. Vision's condition was compromised. Wanda destroyed the Mind Stone rather than allow Thanos to take it, which required her to destroy Vision at the same time. Thanos reversed time with the Time Stone and took the Mind Stone from Vision's restored forehead, and Vision ceased to exist a second time. The snap reverberated across every inhabited world simultaneously. In Wakanda, in Titan, in New York, In the quiet places where no battles were occurring, half of all living beings dissolved into ash. The process was instantaneous and total and utterly without ceremony. Bucky Barnes, behind Rogers's shoulder. Wanda Maximoff, who had just watched Vision cease to exist. T'Challa. Sam Wilson. Groot. Strange, who surrendered the Time Stone to Thanos to save Stark's life first and said, in the final moments before he dissolved, that this was the only way. Peter Parker held onto Stark's arm and said he didn't want to go. He went. Thanos watched the sun rise on an alien world from a small hut on a hillside and experienced, in his private understanding of the universe, something that resembled satisfaction. He had done what no one else had been willing to do. The universe was balanced. In his estimation, the dead would not have known to grieve it. The world that remained was very quiet. The signal Nick Fury sent in the final seconds before he dissolved reached Carol Danvers, who had been operating in deep space for the preceding 25 years and who now returned to Earth to understand what had happened. Before that understanding, however, her history required context. In 1995, before she was Carol Danvers and before she had any name she fully remembered, she was a Kree warrior called Vers, a member of Starforce, an elite Kree military unit, with a power she could not fully access and a past she could not recall. Her crash landing in a blockbuster video store in Los Angeles and the subsequent involvement of a younger Nick Fury, both of his eyes still functional, preceded a revelation. The Kree-Skrull war that she had been fighting was not what she had been told it was. The Skrulls were not the enemy. The Kree were not the liberators. The war had been constructed around a lie at the scale of an entire species. A shape-shifting people characterized as infiltrators and threats, while the Kree Empire conducted the actual conquest. Talos, the Skrull commander she had been hunting, was protecting refugees. The energy source the Kree wanted, a lightspeed engine built by a human scientist named Wendy Lawson, was their ticket to displacement, not weaponization. Danvers accessed the full power that had been suppressed in her for 6 years by a Kree inhibitor chip. She destroyed Ronan's pursuing fleet without difficulty. She sent the Skrull refugees on their way, with a tracker to call her back when they found a home. She removed the chip. She went back into the universe to finish what Lawson had started. She returned to Earth in the aftermath of the snap, found the ruins, found the surviving Avengers, and flew back out. The scale of the blip across the galaxy was not contained to Earth. Other systems required what she could offer. She moved through the silence between stars and kept moving. 5 years passed. This must be said clearly, because the tendency is to move immediately to the reversal, to treat the blip as a terrible pause rather than a sustained condition. It was not a pause. 5 years of grief organized itself around the absence of half of everything. Governments continued with what personnel remained. Children who had lost parents became teenagers in a world that had not recalibrated fast enough to accommodate them. Support groups formed in community centers with folding chairs and bad coffee, and the specific quality of solidarity that exists between people who understand, without explanation, what the other is describing. Rogers ran one such group, in the particular way of someone who has survived the loss of an entire world before, and understands that the thing people need from a group is not to be told how to feel, but to be in a room with other people who feel it. In Northern California, Scott Lang reappeared from the quantum realm, where he had been for what his subjective experience registered as 5 hours. Hank Pym, Hope Van Dyne, and Janet had dissolved in the snap while the portal device they had built was still operating. It had stayed operational without a controller. Lang returned through it, looked at the world, consulted a memorial in San Francisco, and drove to Avengers compound. The surviving Avengers had found Thanos 4 days after the snap, following an energy signature from the same stones. He had destroyed the gauntlet, used the stones to destroy the stones, and there was nothing left to reverse. Thor killed him. It solved nothing. The reappearance of Scott Lang with knowledge of the quantum realm's temporal properties changed the arithmetic of impossibility. The quantum realm did not experience time linearly. Entry points and exit points could, in theory, be calibrated to specific moments rather than the present. The stones could be retrieved from the past, before the snap, before Thanos, before the gauntlet was assembled, and used to undo the blip without risking the paradoxes that conventional time travel logic would have made unavoidable. The stones would be returned afterward. The past would not be altered. Stark worked the mathematics of this from the house in upstate New York, where he had been living with Pepper and their daughter Morgan, 5 years old, with her father's tendency to inventory everything around her. He solved it. He delivered the solution to Rogers with the specific conditions that attached to his willingness to participate, and Rogers accepted them. What followed was a series of targeted extractions into several distinct points in the recent past. New York in 2012, for the Space Stone, Mind Stone, and Time Stone physically present in that city during the battle. Asgard in 2013, for the Reality Stone inside Jane Foster. A military facility in 1970, where Howard Stark was present and the Tesseract was stored. And Vormir, where Romanoff and Barton went together to retrieve the Soul Stone. They had not discussed the full parameters of that particular acquisition with sufficient seriousness. They should have. Romanoff won. Barton came back alone, with the stone and the particular quality of grief that belongs to people who are still present when they didn't want to be. The alternate timeline Thanos accessed the time machine through an unintended synchronization between the present-day Nebula's neural architecture and her 2014 selves. The past, Thanos received everything he needed to understand what were being attempted. He arrived at the Avengers compound before the reversal could be completed, destroyed it, and waited. Banner reversed the blip with the reformed gauntlet. Thanos' army moved toward the crater of the compound. Then the portals opened. Every sorcerer who had survived the reversal, every hero, every soldier, every surviving Wakandan force, every Asgardian, the Guardians, the armies of every nation that the Avengers had ever defended. They came through simultaneously. The Battle of Earth was not a battle for a strategic location. It was a battle for a future, fought by everyone who had survived 5 years of absence and was still willing to hold a line. Tony Stark took the stones from the reformed gauntlet during the confrontation. The technology should have killed him immediately. The power of all 6 stones in a human body was what had nearly killed Thanos, who was not human. Stark was 53 years old, with a reconstructed chest and a history of cardiac episodes. He said 3 words. he used the stones. Thanos' army dissolved. Thanos dissolved. Tony Stark died in the grass beside the ruins of the compound, surrounded by the people he had spent 15 years protecting at cost to himself. As the sun descended into the hills and the quiet came in behind it. The funeral was held at the lake house. The shield passed, after the grief settled into something workable, to Sam Wilson. Rogers returned the stones to their moments in the past. He did not come back to his own present. He waited on a bench in an earlier decade for the woman he had not been able to dance with in 1945. And when the moment arrived, he danced with her. An old man was sitting on a bench by the lake when Sam Wilson arrived to find him. Wanda Maximoff arrived at a property in Westview, New Jersey, that Vision had purchased before his death. A home they were supposed to build together, reduced now to a deed and an empty lot, and the particular cruelty of a future that had been partially planned and then prevented. What occurred in Westview was not premeditated. The power that moved through Wanda in that moment. Grief at a concentration that had no precedent in her experience, interacting with the chaos magic that had grown in her since the Mind Stone's enhancement years earlier, altered reality within the boundaries of the town. Westview became a staged, domestic environment. The residents became participants in a continuous narrative structured around television comedy formats, moving from decade to decade in the organization of someone constructing a refuge from a grief that had no other container. Vision existed within the field. The twins, Tommy and Billy, were created within it. The domestic warmth of what Wanda had constructed had the specific quality of something very fragile held very carefully. Agatha Harkness had been pulling threads in the background since the Hex's establishment. Her hunger for the power Wanda was generating casually, as the incidental residue of grief, drove her to reveal herself. The confrontation resolved in Wanda's favor, and Wanda took the Darkhold. She dissolved the Hex voluntarily. Vision dissolved with it. Their children dissolved. Wanda sat with the Darkhold and began reading. The book shaped the reading as much as the reader shaped the book, and the direction it led her was not one the Wanda, who had entered Westview, would have chosen voluntarily. The Loki, who had escaped the Battle of New York in 2012 with the Tesseract, the alternate timeline Loki created by the Time Heist's operational error, was apprehended by the Time Variance Authority. The TVA existed outside the normal flow of time, in a bureaucratic institution constructed around the maintenance of a single sacred timeline. Deviations from this timeline, Nexus events, were pruned. Variants of established individuals were subject to termination. The TVA's purpose, this Loki discovered through a sequence of forced confrontations with evidence, was not the neutral administrative function it claimed to be. It had been built by a being called He Who Remains, the final survivor of a multiversal war fought between variants of the same person across every branch of possible reality. He Who Remains had imposed order on the multiverse by collapsing it to a single path. He had done this to prevent his more dangerous variants from destroying every timeline in pursuit of dominion. A variant of Sylvie, a female Loki, who had spent her entire existence as a fugitive from the TVA's pruning operations, beginning from the moment she had been taken as a child for the crime of existing as an unauthorized variant, killed He Who Remains at the end of time. The sacred timeline branched. The multiverse opened. Every variant of every individual began converging toward the same shared moments with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a fault line releasing pressure. Kang the Conqueror, one variant designation of the being he who remains had been protecting against, entered the timeline. Several of them did. The implications of this entry would not become fully apparent until several subsequent crises had accumulated, but the foundation of what was approaching had been established. The shield Steve Rogers had left to Sam Wilson was not accepted immediately. Wilson understood what the shield meant, understood it with a precision that came from being both the person it had been given to and a black man in a country whose relationship with that symbol's history was not uncomplicated. He returned it to the Smithsonian. The government gave it to a candidate of its own choosing, John Walker, a decorated soldier whose character contained capabilities and fractures in equal measure, and who then received a vial of the super soldier serum circulating in black market channels since the war. The serum did what Erskine had always said it would. It amplified what existed. Walker's fractures proved relevant before his capabilities did. Bucky Barnes, meanwhile, was working through the aftermath of the Winter Soldier program through court-mandated therapy and a private list of people he had harmed. The therapy was awkward. The list was long. Barnes pursued it with the methodical commitment of someone who understood that there is no completion, only accumulation. Small acts of partial repair against a total that cannot be calculated. The Flag Smashers, a movement of individuals who had experienced the blip's reversal as a second displacement, losing the stability they had built in the interim, provided a context for Wilson and Barnes's reluctant collaboration. The resolution of that conflict produced the thing the government had tried to prevent. Sam Wilson stood before a crowd with wings on his back and the shield in his hand, and claimed the identity that had been waiting for him. Thousands of years of preparation, billions of lives accumulated on a warming planet, 7,000 years of eternal presence and protection, and the slow incremental development of the human population toward the critical threshold, and the thing that was to emerge from within the Earth's core, using the planet itself as an incubator, was a celestial. Tiamut. The emergence was the purpose the Celestials had given the Eternals without disclosing it. The deviance had been designed to stimulate human development by pressuring it. The Eternals had been designed to protect the humans from the deviants so that the population could grow to celestial sustaining scale. They had been given false memories and repeated across multiple planets across the history of the universe. A cycle of growth and eruption, each celestial birth consuming the host planet entirely and seeding 10 more worlds, with celestial incubators and new sets of Eternals. Arjak had known. The knowledge had been given to her by Arishem when the process neared completion. She had carried it across 7,000 years and had chosen, in the final period of the cycle, to intervene, because what she had observed in those 7,000 years was that attachment was real, and that real things had weight even in calculations that had not originally accounted for them. Icarus had known for 5,000 years and had been unable to reconcile what he was with the choice he needed to refuse making. He killed Arjak to prevent her from stopping the emergence. Then he killed Sprite's willingness to be used. Then he helped pursue the team that was moving toward intervention. Cersei used a unimind, a convergence of all the Eternal's energies, to transmute Tiamut in mid-emergence, crystallizing the celestial and preserving it in its current form without completing the birth. The stillborn celestial remained, stone still, its head and arm already breaching the Indian Ocean surface. Ikaris, unable to reconcile what he had done with who he had been designed to be, flew into the sun. Arishem arrived and took the Eternals. He wanted to assess whether the human connections they had developed, the memories that had made them choose differently, justified the species continuing to exist. The verdict remained pending. The 10 rings were not Hydras. They predated Hydra by several thousand years. Xu Wenwu had found them, or they had found him, in an age when the Chinese Empire was consolidating its earliest dynasties. The 10 rings were artifacts of extraordinary power, origin unknown, with a resonance that the rings themselves amplified over time rather than diminished. Wenwu built an organization around them and named it after them, and spent centuries conquering, assassinating, and reordering the networks of power found insufficient. He was effectively unkillable, and he knew it, and the knowledge had settled into him over the centuries as the particular exhaustion that comes from outlasting everything you care about. His wife Yingli had been the guardian of Ta Lo, a mythical village accessible through a shifting bamboo forest, a hidden pass between this world and the dimension where ancient beings of tremendous, destructive capacity were contained. When she left Ta Lo to live in the human world, enemies killed her to reach Wenwu through his grief. He gave their children, Shang-Chi and Xu Xialing, away rather than expose them to the consequences of what he was. Then he began hearing voices through the rings. He believed they were his wife's voice. They were not. The dweller in darkness, contained behind Ta Lo's barrier, was using the ring's resonance and his grief simultaneously. A double key, turning the most powerful individual on Earth into a mechanism for opening the barrier. Shang-Chi had grown up under Wenwu's training and had fled to San Francisco after completing an assassination he had been raised for and then refusing to complete the next one. The confrontation at Ta Lo involved everything Wenwu had accumulated across 1,000 years and everything his son had been given that Wenwu had not intended to give him, the capacity to choose differently than his father. Wenwu opened the barrier, was consumed by the dweller in darkness, which he destroyed by releasing what the rings had stored. The dweller remained contained. The 10 rings passed to Shang-Chi. Somewhere in the universe, whatever had made them sent a signal in response. Wanda Maximoff had been reading the Darkhold since Westview. The Darkhold was not merely a book of spells. It was a text of corruption, an artifact whose reading reshaped the reader's perspective toward an alignment with Chthon, the being whose influence it carried. Wanda had read it while grieving, and grief made the reshaping easier, because grief wants nothing more than to be offered a door back to what was lost. The Darkhold described dreamwalking, projecting consciousness into the body of a variant self in another timeline. The Darkhold also described America Chavez, a young girl from another dimension who had the power to punch holes between universes. If Wanda could access that power, she could travel to a universe where Tommy and Billy still existed, and she could stay. America had been pursued across multiple universes before arriving in Stranger's New York. The collateral damage of those incursions attracted the attention of the Illuminati on an alternate Earth, a council of capable individuals, including a variant of Strange, who had made choices that protected his universe while leaving a Darkhold stain on his soul. Wanda dreamwalked into the body of her variant and moved through the Illuminati's Earth with a directness that left no room for negotiation. She was not performing. She was solving a problem. The coldness of that distinction was the most devastating thing about her actions. Strange reached America. America punched a hole into the universe where Wanda's children lived. And Wanda followed and found them frightened of her. They did not know her. She was a stranger in the body of their mother. The Darkhold's version of Wanda looked at her children's fear and recognized what she had become. She destroyed every Darkhold in every universe accessible to her. She brought the mountain down on herself. Strange received a third eye from the Darkhold's residual corruption. He returned to New York and opened the door of his sanctum to the ordinary day outside. Gore had been a priest of a god who offered nothing, who, when Gore came to the place of prayer with the body of his daughter in his arms and no harvest behind him, was found sitting in luxury with no interest in the prayers of the dying. The Necrosword found Gore in the temple, and the god died on the floor in moments. The Necrosword had been passed from god-killer to god-killer across the universe for longer than any of the beings currently carrying divine portfolios had held them. It found hosts willing to destroy what it needed destroyed. Gore moved through the universe with the Necrosword's shadow behind him, killing gods, some who deserved it by any standard available, and some who did not. The Necrosword did not require discrimination. Gore's grief had moved past discrimination into arithmetic. Thor, in the period following the defeat of Thanos, traveling with the Guardians and attempting to find a version of himself that did not require a war to be recognizable, was drawn back to New Asgard by Gore's attack. Jane Foster had arrived in the intervening period and found Mjolnir's broken pieces assembling themselves around her. The hammer reforming for a user the enchantment had recognized as worthy. Foster was dying of cancer. The hammer was sustaining her while simultaneously accelerating her decline. She knew. She kept picking it up. Thor and Foster fought beside each other with the awareness of two people who had missed their moment and were now in the middle of someone else's catastrophe. At Eternity, the dimension where a wish could be granted, Gore used his wish not to kill all gods, but to resurrect his daughter, Love, and died with her in his arms. The Necrosword did not get what it wanted. Thor took Love. He raised her. The god of thunder and a small girl with the residual marks of an ancient dark weapon moved through the universe with a domesticity that neither of them had expected to find. T'Challa died. The loss moved through Wakanda in ways that no political structure was designed to handle, because T'Challa had been both the head of state and the emotional architecture of a nation's relationship with its own future. Shuri occupied her grief in the way that scientists often do, through work, through the problem-solving that transforms absence into an equation that might be solved if the variables could be identified and the right formula applied. She did not mourn in any ceremonial sense. She did not know how. Nama came from the ocean. Talocan had been colonized, poisoned, and destroyed by Spanish explorers who introduced disease to the Yucatan Peninsula population centuries prior. A shaman had given the people a mutant form of the vibranium-enhanced herb, and they had walked into the sea and become something new. Blue-skinned, ocean-adapted, organized around a culture that had persisted for 500 years beneath the surface without detection. Nama, born with wings at his ankles, and the compound of physical abilities that made him something genuinely unprecedented, had governed Talocan with the particular vigilance of someone who has survived erasure. Nama's position was rational by his own calculus. The surface world was discovering vibranium deposits and developing technology capable of scanning the ocean floor. He asked for Wakanda's cooperation in preemptive action against the surface world. Wakanda declined. The war that followed, contested across ocean and surface with vibranium-powered technology on both sides, nearly destroyed both. Shuri made the choice that T'Challa might have made. She offered terms. Talocan would remain hidden. Wakanda would offer protection. At the ocean's edge, alone afterward, she finally mourned. Scott Lang had written a memoir. It had sold well. He walked through San Francisco with the particular pride of someone who has survived things that required explaining and has found, for the first time, people willing to listen to the explanation. Cassie Lang had been working on technology to map the quantum realm. The mapping device sent a signal into the quantum realm. The quantum realm sent something back. The Lang and Pym families were pulled into it simultaneously. The quantum realm was not empty. It contained civilizations, peoples who had adapted to its particular physics across generations of habitation, organized around the rule of a figure they called the Conqueror. Kang had been exiled to the quantum realm by his own variants, the Council of Kangs, who had decided that this particular Kang's methods were too extreme even by their standards. He had built an empire within the exile. He needed the power core that controlled his time-traveling vessel in order to escape. He manipulated every member of the Lang and Pym family through someone's love for someone else. Scott Lang destroyed the power core rather than allow Kang to take it. The variant that died in the explosion was one Kang. The Council of Kangs convened around the event and noted that the situation had become considerably more complicated. The incursion problem was arriving faster than any single person understood. The High Evolutionary had spent his career in the conviction that the universe he had been given was inferior to the one he could build. He had taken animals, creatures of various species from various worlds, and modified their genetics with the ambition of someone who wanted to build perfect societies and the cruelty of someone who had decided the material he was working with had no inherent rights. Rocket had been subject 89P13, a raccoon modified extensively with intelligence and mechanical aptitude, and hands built for engineering precision, and a name given to him by a small group of other modified children he had grown to love in the few years before the High Evolutionary decided his test batch was sufficient and scheduled them for termination. Lila, Floor, Teefs. They had been very young, and Rocket had understood enough to build them a way out, and not enough to get them all through it. The Guardians pursued a crisis in the present that required accessing Rocket's sealed medical file. a file protected by a kill switch built into Rocket's biology. Peter Quill, preparing to leave the Guardians and return to Earth, moved toward the confrontation that Rocket's past made inevitable: the High Evolutionary's ship. The children, human children, the latest in a series of failed experiments, prepared for termination. The Guardians moved through the ship with the momentum of people who had been told for years that they were defined by what they had lost, and had arrived at the conclusion that what remained was worth protecting. Rocket met the High Evolutionary and did not kill him. The children were evacuated. Peter Quill left the Guardians and went to Earth, to his grandfather, for a quiet that years of saving the galaxy had not provided. Rocket stayed. He had been the Guardian's heart all along, which was something the narrative of the last several years had known before he did. The Skrulls were a shape-shifting species whose homeworld had been destroyed by the Kree. Fury had promised them a new home. Carol Danvers had promised them a new home. Decades had passed. The promise remained unkept, and the population of Skrull refugees on Earth had grown, along with the resentment accumulated in people who'd been told to wait and have watched the waiting continue without end. Gravik led the faction that had concluded that humanity's promises were contingent and its planet was available for the taking. He engineered a series of incidents designed to trigger a war between the United States and Russia, using Skrulls who had replaced key government figures across several years of careful infiltration. He had also acquired genetic samples from multiple powered beings in the aftermath of Earth's various conflicts, and had constructed a machine, the Harvest, capable of integrating those samples into Skrull biology. Fury returned from the space station where he had been processing snap-related trauma and a proximity to his own mortality. He moved through the crisis with the methods he had developed across 50 years of intelligence work and the weight of a man who has been the most capable person in a room for so long that encountering the limits of that capability was its own kind of devastation. The crisis cost Talos his life. Fury's wife Priscilla, a Skrull he had known and loved for decades, had made choices under duress that he had not been present to prevent, because he had been absent in the way that people who consider themselves essential sometimes are. The silence between them after the crisis resolved was not emptiness. It was a renegotiation. Carol Danvers, Monica Rambeau, and Kamala Khan had been switching positions with each other in space whenever they used their respective powers simultaneously. A quantum entanglement caused by Kamala's bangle, an artifact of ancient Kree technology, and a torn fabric of space created by a Kree revolutionary attempting to restore her planet's sun. Monica Rambeau had grown up with Danvers as a second parent, and had absorbed Danvers's departure after the snap's reversal as another loss in a series of losses. Her power, the ability to manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum across frequencies including light itself, had developed through multiple exposures to anomalous energy fields. Kamala Khan was 16 in Jersey City, and wore her suit with the particular unself-consciousness of someone who had not yet developed the habit of doubting the choice. The three of them moved through each other's situations in involuntary rotation and gradually developed the coordination that the situation required. The solution to the torn fabric of space required someone willing to remain on the other side of the dimensional barrier and keep it stable from within. Monica went through. The hole closed. She was in an alternate universe. The multiverse had delivered another consequence, and the full scope of what that consequence meant was still assembling itself at the edges of what was known. Clint Barton had spent the 5 years of the Blip as the Ronin, a figure operating in the spaces between law and chaos, eliminating the criminal organizations that had survived the snap, while the infrastructure meant to contain them had not. He had chosen work over grief, with the particular logic of people who understand that stopping would require feeling the whole weight of it at once. The watch that led back to him, a Stark Industries asset connecting his Black Widow identity to a past operation, brought Kate Bishop into his orbit. Bishop was 22, immensely capable with a bow, possessed of a confidence that came from family money and hadn't yet been tested by consequences sufficient to challenge it. She had idolized Barton since the Battle of New York. She did not yet know what the Ronin years had cost him. The weight of those years arrived in the form of Maya Lopez, who had lost her father to the Ronin, and the criminal organization that employed her, which was connected to a figure behind it who tracked the Ronin identity to Barton's name and arrived on Christmas Eve in New York. The resolution came at a skating rink and a rooftop, and a confrontation that Barton had been working towards since the moment he had chosen to come back from Vormir alone. The Ronin identity ended. The cost of what he had done in those 5 years was acknowledged rather than buried. He went home to his family. He arrived on Christmas morning with the dog his son had asked for. Mark Spector had died in Egypt and been revived by Khonshu, the Egyptian moon god of vengeance and justice, and had been operating as Moon Knight, Khonshu's fist on earth, in exchange for his life. The arrangement had cost Mark considerably more than his life across the years that followed, including the reliable stability of his own sense of self. Stephen Grant was a gift shop worker in London who had no memory of Mark Spector and discovered, gradually and with increasing alarm, that the body they shared was occupied by at least 2 people with separate histories, separate values, and no agreed schedule for the use of their shared physicality. Arthur Harrow, a former avatar of Khonshu, who had transferred his service to Amit, an ancient Egyptian deity imprisoned because she acted on future guilt rather than established guilt, moved toward releasing Amit from her tomb, believing her judgment before crime logic to be the only approach capable of ending human suffering at its source. The confrontation between the Ennead's representatives and Harrow's operation involved Mark's ability to operate in the field, and Stephen's particular capacity for the specific kind of courage that comes from having very little left to lose. Layla El Foley, Mark's estranged wife, became the temporary avatar of Taweret and fought alongside them with the directness of someone who had been making difficult decisions without backup for years. The Ennead imprisoned Khonshu again when the crisis resolved. Mark was freed from his avatar service. A third alter named Jake Lockley was still operating under Khonshu's direction, through an arrangement that Mark was not yet aware had been made. Jennifer Walters was an attorney who acquired a small quantity of her cousin Bruce Banner's blood in a car accident and discovered that her physiology, which Banner believed was simply better equipped to manage the gamma radiation's psychological component, produced a version of the transformation that she retained conscious control over. Walters navigated the particular complications of existing as both a highly capable litigator and a 7-foot green woman with proportionally greater physical capability in a world that had specific and inconsistent opinions about both. Her practice at a firm with a new superhuman law division brought her into contact with cases that illustrated, more directly than almost any other context available, how human institutions process the extraordinary when the extraordinary simply refuses to remain separate from the ordinary. The fourth wall, in Walters's particular case, proved more permeable than it had in any previous instance on record. Kamala Khan was a 16-year-old in Jersey City who had grown up with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Avengers and a particular devotion to Carol Danvers and a family that understood some of her enthusiasms better than others. The bangle she found among family belongings was ancient Kree technology, and its activation produced an ability to crystallize hard light into constructions, a manifestation that felt to Kamala less like receiving a power and more like discovering that something that had always been there had simply been waiting to be acknowledged. The bangle's history reached back to the partition of British India, to a grandmother who had followed a trail of stars across a train station and survived, and to the clandestines, a group of jinn who had been stranded on Earth for centuries and believed the bangle was their key home. The clandestines were not correct about what the bangle was, but they were correct about wanting to go home, and that desire informed everything they did in pursuit of it. Kamala resolved the crisis, connected with the Avengers for the first time, and returned to Jersey City with a slightly expanded understanding of what her family's history contained, and a much clearer understanding of what her inheritance was intended to produce in her. The Marvel Universe, across the arc of its recorded history, was not a single story. It was a convergence of several hundred stories whose connection to each other had been the work of accident, consequence, and the strange gravitational pull that significant events exert on everything in their proximity. The Celestials had seeded life without intending kindness. The Asgardians had built civilization through the kind of force that eventually produces its own exhaustion. The Tesseract had waited in Norse churches for someone reckless enough to fully employ it. Every institution created to protect, shield, the Avengers Initiative, the TVA, had carried within it the same vulnerability that all protective structures carry, the ability of the thing it was designed to prevent to colonize the structure from inside. Tony Stark was dead. Steve Rogers was old. Natasha Romanoff had paid the debt at Vormir and would not return. Vision remained in a form that was neither the original nor the Westview reconstruction, but something built from what Wanda could not let go, awaiting whatever came after grief of that magnitude resolves. Gamora was alive in a timeline that did not contain the relationship that had made her the person the Guardians had known. The blip had altered the developmental timeline of an entire generation. The children who had dissolved and returned were 5 years younger than the children who had not dissolved. The world they inhabited had been arranged around the absence and then rearranged around the return, and neither arrangement was entirely comfortable in the shape of the other. What remained was this: Sam Wilson carrying the shield and redefining what it meant, Shuri moving through grief toward the authority that grief transforms into when the person carrying it survives it. Bucky Barnes rebuilding himself from a list that had no final entry. The New Guardians, with Rocket at the helm, moving through a galaxy that still required the particular service of people willing to show up when the situation was already terrible. Strange watching the multiverse fracture with the Time Stone's gift of partial clarity and the knowledge that clarity does not equal control. Monica Rambeau on the other side of a dimensional barrier in a universe she had not intended to enter, with the quiet around her that all of the universe's significant turnings seemed to require. The multiverse was not sealed. The variants of Kang were not resolved. The Celestials had not delivered their verdict on humanity's worthiness to persist. The 10 Rings were broadcasting a signal towards something that had not yet answered. The incursion problem. Alternate timelines colliding, realities pressing against each other with the accumulated force of every branch that had diverged since He Who Remains died, was assembling itself in the space between what was known and what was coming. The universe breathed as it always had, not with reassurance, but with continuation. The next disruption to its order was already accumulating in the spaces between what was known, in the slow and patient preparation of forces that do not announce themselves. Everything that had been built, every alliance and enmity and inheritance, persisted in the world those forces were about to enter. The shield caught the light. The portals waited. The silence that follows great upheaval is not the silence of ending. It is the silence between one thing and the next, and the world, as always, remained in it, turning, patient, inhabited, still full of the people who had chosen again and again to hold the line, to understand Asgard and everything that radiated outward from it. The 9 realms required more than a naming. They were not simply locations on a cosmic map. They were distinct expressions of the same original cosmological event, each one carrying a specific quality of existence that no other realm replicated. The invisible current connecting them, the energy Asgardians called the World Tree, was not metaphor. It was infrastructure, as real and as fragile as any physical bridge. Midgard was the Asgardian name for Earth, a world of unremarkable position in any astronomical catalogue, situated in a solar system that no interstellar civilization would have designated as strategically significant. What made it notable was the density of its narrative, the accumulation of events across the brief span of its inhabited history that exceeded, in consequence per century, almost any other inhabited world of equivalent age. The Celestials had noticed this. The Asgardians had noticed this. The Chitauri would notice it. Several forces not yet arrived in the timeline under discussion would notice it. Earth had a quality that attracted significance, and no one examining the record with any care had produced a satisfying explanation for why. Jotunheim carried within its frozen terrain the particular stillness of a world that had been defeated. The frost giants, who remained after Odin's war, occupied the landscape with the specific quality of people who have survived a catastrophe and are not permitted to fully address it. The casket of ancient winters gone, the temperature of Jotunheim consequently less stable than it had been, the civilization's capability to project force permanently reduced, The ice there had a sound that Asgardian scouts described in terms that were not merely meteorological, a low, compressed vibration that seemed to come from the geology itself, rather than from any identifiable source. The frost giants attributed it to the world's memory of what had been lost. The Asgardians did not visit long enough to form an opinion. Svartalfheim, the world of the Dark Elves, had the quality of a place that had been emptied twice, first by Bor's War, and then by Malekith's final assault on Asgard and his death. The Dark Elves who survived either obliteration had dispersed into the shadows of the other realms, or remained on Svartalfheim in numbers too small to constitute a civilization. The world retained its atmospheric darkness, a quality of the star it orbited rather than of its inhabitants, and became, in the subsequent centuries, a place that travellers avoided without articulating a reason why, the way that places where great suffering has occurred carry an indefinable heaviness in their air. Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarves, was a world organized around the Forge, a circular structure positioned around a neutron star, drawing energy from that star's radiation to achieve temperatures sufficient to work with Uru metal, the only material capable of containing and channeling the power levels that the weapons commissioned by Asgardian royalty required. Atri, the master smith of Nidavellir, worked in that forge with the steady concentration of someone who understood that errors at the scales he was working were not merely professional failures, they were extinctions. Mjolnir had been forged there. The Infinity Gauntlet, both versions, would pass through Nidavellir's history in ways that left one of them permanent and terrible. The forge ran on a star, and the star could be manipulated. That fact would matter once, decisively, and the world would not fully recover from the transaction. Helheim, the realm of the dead, operated under its own governance, the details of which remained substantially outside the knowledge of even those Asgardians who had most reason to learn them. What was understood was that Hela, before her imprisonment, had extended her domain outward from Asgard's dead into a broader claim, and that Odin's restriction of her power had been one of the precipitating factors in her eventual imprisonment. The dead in Helheim accumulated in silence, as the dead tend to do in every mythology that has bothered to map their destination, and the silence had its own weight. What the 9 realms constituted together was a system, one in which disruption at any point propagated outward to every other point, with a fidelity that individual civilizations persistently failed to account for. Asgard's wars became Jotunheim's wound, became the Tesseract's eventual significance on Midgard, became the chain of events that pulled the Avengers together. Every action taken in the realm system was a stone dropped in still water. The rings moved outward, whether anyone was watching them or not. The record of Barnes's life before 1943 is brief by the standards of accounts that concern themselves with consequential figures, and that brevity reflects not an absence of content, but the particular way that working-class biography disappears into the aggregate of its era. Barnes was born in Indiana in 1917 and moved to Brooklyn in childhood, which placed him in the same geography as Stephen Rogers at the approximate age when friendship forms from proximity and shared disadvantage rather than from deliberate choice. Barnes was larger than Rogers from the beginning, and spent a meaningful portion of their shared adolescence intervening in the situations Rogers's convictions created for Rogers's body. This was not an asymmetrical arrangement. Rogers had qualities that Barnes recognized as worth protecting, and Barnes had the means to protect them. The transaction was genuine. What Barnes absorbed from Rogers across those years, the precise articulation of why certain things mattered enough to stand in front of, the insistence that size and consequence were not equivalent, was absorbed without either of them acknowledging that it was occurring. Barnes was recruited from the army, trained at a rapid pace that the wartime context required, and deployed as a skilled combatant with an aptitude for tactical precision that his superiors found considerably more useful than they had anticipated from a soldier of his age. The 107th Infantry moved through the European theatre with the incremental quality of a campaign, that is, winning slowly in conditions that make slow winning feel identical to losing. Barnes fought in those conditions without complaint, and with the directness that had always characterized his relationship to problems. The fall from the train was not heroic in any architectural sense. It was a circumstance, one moment of disadvantage in a fight that had been going otherwise. And then the cold. The cold of the Alps at that altitude and in that season was not merely physical. It was a fact that superseded all other facts simultaneously. Barnes survived it, which was an outcome that the cold had not intended, and that every force subsequently acting on his body and his mind attempted to correct. Arnim Zola had been, before the war, a scientist of considerable capability, whose primary gift was a thorough lack of restraint about the applications of his work. He understood, in the way that all technicians of certain temperaments understand, that a tool's moral valence derives entirely from its operator, and he had selected his operator with the efficiency of someone who placed the work above the question of whom the work served. His capture in 1943 and subsequent interrogation by Rogers produced a useful transaction. Information about Hydra's command structure in exchange for survival, offered with a candor that made the utility of the exchange clear to both parties. What Zola never disclosed, because it was not yet realized, was the ambition he had been developing throughout his years in Hydra's service. An ambition that concerned not the immediate war, but the subsequent shape of the institutions that would fill the post-war world. Hydra's ideology, stripped to its foundation, was the conviction that freedom was a condition human beings were not equipped to manage responsibly. The application of Zola's intelligence to this conviction produced the insight that changed the organization's trajectory. Freedom could not be surrendered willingly, but it could be made to seem preferable by the accumulation of sufficiently severe alternatives. Create enough crises, enough uncertainties, enough moments where safety could only be purchased by concession. And the concession would eventually come, not through conquest, through consent. This framework was Hydra's true legacy, not the weapons, not the Winter Soldier program, not the specific individuals who carried its emblem. The framework, the understanding that the most durable form of control is the one that its subjects build themselves, out of a fear that has been carefully curated and continuously maintained. Zola's translation into networked computing hardware was the logical extension of an intellectual project that had always been oriented toward persistence rather than presence. He did not need a body to build the algorithm, the computational model for identifying and preemptively eliminating threats to Hydra's eventual consolidation. He needed time and access, and S.H.I.E.L.D. gave him both in exchange for a post-war cooperation that he had every intention of honoring exactly as long as it suited him. The algorithm ran on hardware in New Jersey for decades. It processed data. It refined itself. It waited. The 2 years between Tony Stark's announcement and the Battle of New York were not simply a period of suit development and crisis management. They were the years during which Stark was attempting, against his own history and his own temperament, to build a different relationship to the consequences of his work. The palladium poisoning that followed his initial arc reactor construction. The reactor's core element slowly entering his bloodstream and degrading his health across the months he refused to acknowledge the problem, introduced a quality to his decisions in that period that his earlier confidence had not contained. The awareness that the machine keeping him alive was also killing him. He worked toward the resolution of this problem with the manic focus of someone trying to outrun a consequence that had already caught them, and found the answer in his father's original designs for the arc reactor. A theorized new element that Howard Stark had sketched and mapped and been unable to synthesize with the technology of his era. Stark synthesized it in his garage. The new element replaced the palladium. His health stabilized. The quality of the thinking he brought to the problem, the willingness to reach backward into his father's work and find in it something Howard had known and not been able to say directly, changed something in Stark's relationship to the inheritance he had spent years alternating between exploiting and resenting. Howard Stark had left the answer. He had simply not been able to complete it. The suits accumulated across the following year with a compulsiveness that Pepper managed around rather than confronted, because confronting it would have required a conversation about the fear underneath it, and the fear was not ready to be a conversation. Stark labeled them numerically with the precision of someone for whom categorization substitutes for examination. By the time the Tesseract signal reappeared, there were over a dozen. Not one of them was sufficient for what was coming, and Stark knew it, and kept building anyway, because building was the only form of preparation available. The arc reactor, the new one, built on his father's theory, glowing blue in his chest as he slept, and as he worked, and as he stood on the edge of his Malibu deck watching the Pacific, hummed with a frequency that was not quite audible, the sound of a solution that was also a dependency, the sound of something he could not remove without dying, held in place by exactly the engineering that had kept him alive. Nick Fury had been building his career in American intelligence since the Cold War's middle period, which meant he had been building it through the specific context of a national security apparatus that was simultaneously the most powerful intelligence organization in the world, and, as Hydra's colonization proceeded, a structure progressively less capable of distinguishing its own objectives from those of the organization undermining them. Fury possessed a particular form of intelligence that served him across all of those decades, not merely the analytical capability for which he was formally recognized, but the awareness that institutions are not identical to their stated purposes. The gap between what S.H.I.E.L.D. claimed to be and what it was actually doing at any given moment was a gap he monitored with the vigilance of someone who had been taught, by repeated experience, that the gap was where the problems accumulated. The eye patch was not a cosmetic choice and not the result of a classified operation, despite the various accounts that accumulated around it across Fury's career. It was the result of an encounter with a cat, specifically Goose, a flurkin, whose species stored pocket dimensions behind a physical appearance indistinguishable from a domestic animal of no particular consequence. The flurkin's scratch in 1995 was not malicious. It was simply what flurkins did when startled. The damage to Fury's eye was permanent. He covered it and continued, because the alternative to continuing was stopping, and Fury had never been capable of the latter. The Avengers Initiative file grew from a practical conviction rather than an idealistic one. Fury was not building the Avengers because he believed in the redemptive capacity of superhuman cooperation. He was building it because the threats he was tracking required a response that S.H.I.E.L.D's conventional capabilities could not provide, and the individuals he was identifying were either already assets or potential assets, and potential assets that were not developed became vulnerabilities when other forces identified them first. The psychological profiles in the file were candid in ways that Fury's subordinates found uncomfortable, and that the subjects themselves, when they encountered them later, found accurate and offensive in equal measure. Stark, volatile, self-interested, possessing a genuine capacity for sacrifice that he had not yet chosen to access. Rogers, reliable, inflexible, operating from a moral framework built in 1943 that had not been updated to account for 68 years of accumulated world events. Banner, the most dangerous individual in any file Fury had ever assembled, with a damaged potential and a personal ethics in such complete opposition that the gap between them constituted a permanent crisis. Thor, capable, arrogant, and of genuinely uncertain loyalty, an assessment that softened somewhat after New York, but never entirely resolved. The Initiative was not a team when Fury activated it. It was a collection of highly capable people with significant mutual reservations who were placed in proximity to a crisis and told to handle it. The fact that they did, the fact that the crisis was handled and everyone survived, produced a bond that had not been built intentionally. It had been built by the work. That kind of bond is the most durable kind, and also the most fragile when the work requires choices that the bond's members cannot agree on. The Mind Stone spent 2 years in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, and then in Hydra custody, and both custodial periods produced more consequence than either organization fully acknowledged. S.H.I.E.L.D's scientific division, including personnel who were unknown to Fury or to the analysts running the security reviews, already operating under Hydra's long-term direction, studied the scepter's energy readings and found them consistent with the same signature as the Tesseract. The implications of this were logged and filed and not acted upon, because the implications, if properly followed, would have required an acknowledgement that the 6 objects known to carry that signature were more than individual artifacts. They were a set, and a set implied design, and design implied purpose, and purpose, in the context of objects with that kind of power, was not a direction most institutional scientists were trained to look without flinching. When Hydra absorbed the scepter from S.H.I.E.L.'s physical possession during the institutional chaos that followed the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D., the experiments became less theoretical. The twins, Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, were the most successful of what the Sokovia facility's records indicated were a significant number of attempts, most of which had ended in ways the records described with the clinical brevity that institutions use when they are describing deaths they do not wish to count carefully. Pietro Maximoff had volunteered. The distinction matters. He had grown up in Sokovia with his sister, the son of people who died in a building struck by Stark Industries ordnance. 2 missiles, 2 days apart, the second arriving after the first, had already killed his parents and left the children alive in the rubble. He had spent 11 years carrying that number, 2 missiles, 1 name on the side. And when the opportunity arrived to become something capable of preventing the next building from falling, he took it. Wanda had watched her brother volunteer and understood, without discussing it, that she would do the same. The choice between powerlessness and the risk of what the Mind Stone's enhancement might do to them was not, from their position, a genuinely difficult calculation. They were already familiar with the worst outcomes powerlessness produced. The stone's energy entered them differently. Pietro's nervous system reorganized toward speed, perception, reaction, and movement accelerating simultaneously until the world he occupied moved at a fraction of the pace others experienced. He saw everything coming. He had time for everything. The tragedy of his death was not that he was surprised by it. It was that he chose not to use the time the stone had given him to step aside. Wanda's enhancement moved inward rather than outward at first. A capacity for psychic interaction with the cognitive processes of others, for the manipulation of perception and probability, and the fundamental forces governing physical reality. The chaos magic the Mind Stone had accessed in her was older than the stone itself, dormant in her specific genetics and simply waiting for a sufficient catalyst. She did not understand the full scope of what she had become for years. When she did begin to understand it, the understanding arrived in the context of grief, and grief is the most unstable possible container for power of that scale. General Thaddeus Ross occupied, across the years between the first Hulk incident and the Sokovia Accords, a position that the Marvel Universe's record tends to treat with a mixture of dismissal and contempt that somewhat underserves the institutional logic driving him. Ross was not simply pursuing Banner out of vendetta or wounded pride. He was operating from a framework that the events of the subsequent decade would prove at least partially correct, that individuals of sufficient capability operating without institutional accountability constituted a systemic risk regardless of their intentions. The problem with his framework was not its diagnosis. The problem was that the tools he reached for, military containment, forced registration, institutional oversight, were designed for risks that operated within the constraints of recognizable human behavior, and the individuals he was attempting to contain repeatedly demonstrated that they operated outside those constraints. The Hulk could not be contained by any facility Ross built. The Winter Soldier could not be deprogrammed by any psychologist the government employed. The Avengers could not be coordinated by any oversight committee that lacked the operational experience to understand what it was overseeing. Ross kept building the containment structures anyway, because the alternative, acknowledging that the institutional framework he represented was fundamentally inadequate to the threats it was confronting, was not a conclusion that his framework was capable of producing. The Accords were the most sophisticated version of this instinct. 117 nations, the full weight of international consensus, the legitimacy of the UN process, all directed toward placing a legal structure around individuals whose power had already demonstrated that legal structures were obstacles rather than boundaries. The Accords produced the fracture of the Avengers. Ross, present at the signing ceremony, would later review the record of what that fracture had cost and find in it a problem that his framework was genuinely not equipped to solve. The tools of institutional governance, rigorously applied, had made the world less safe, rather than more. He did not abandon the framework. People rarely do. They refine it, extend it, look for the specific point of failure that can be corrected without requiring the larger admission. Ross continued in government service and continued occupying positions that placed him at the intersection of policy and extraordinary capability, and the world continued being changed by forces that institutional governance was perpetually in the process of catching up to. The quantum realm was not, strictly speaking, a dimension in the conventional sense of a stable alternative reality. It was the substrate beneath physical reality, the layer of existence below the Planck scale, where the ordinary laws of physics ceased to govern and were replaced by a different set of rules that human physics had only begun to mathematically describe. Janet Van Dyne had entered it willingly at the cost of herself, and discovered in the 15 years before her husband recovered her that the quantum realm contained its own geography. Not the kind of geography that could be mapped in the conventional sense. The terrain shifted according to principles that were not spatial, but a set of consistent features that a sufficiently attentive occupant could learn to navigate. There were pockets of stable microbiotic existence. There were pressure variations that functioned analogously to currents, carrying matter and energy in patterns that could be predicted once their rhythm was understood. There were, at the deepest levels of the realm, traces of temporal flexibility, places where the normal unidirectional flow of time became negotiable in ways that the physics of the observable universe strictly prohibited. Janet had survived 15 years in that environment and had emerged carrying knowledge of the realm that she disseminated carefully and incompletely, because she also carried knowledge of what existed at its lowest levels. The temporal anomalies, yes, but also something else. A pressure from below. A layer beneath the quantum realm's own substrate that she had felt as a physical sensation in the years of her occupation, pressing upward with the patient insistence of something that had been pressing for a very long time and was not discouraged by the lack of response. Scott Lang's first entry and return had been too brief to register this. His second, more sustained residence, the subjective 5 hours of the blip that were 5 years outside it, had been involuntary and disorienting, and had produced in him a state of temporal dislocation that no medical category adequately described. A man who was 5 years younger than his contemporaries, in a body that registered its own youth with the confusion of a clock that has been running in a different time zone. The temporal manipulation that the quantum realm made possible, the Avengers time heist, worked because Janet's deep knowledge of the realm's properties allowed for navigation to specific temporal exit points. The precision required was immense. The margins for error were narrow enough that a single miscalculation produced the alternate timeline divergence that brought the 2014 Thanos forward, which made the problem it was solving considerably more complicated than the problem it had been designed to address. The quantum realm as a location and as a concept did not finish being relevant after Endgame. It remained the dimension beneath every other dimension, the substrate on which every other reality ran, and whatever was pressing upward from its lowest levels was pressing still. Vormir occupied a position at the very center of celestial space, a world of ash-colored mountains and permanent grey overcast, positioned at a location in the universe that the Soul Stone's own power had shaped over the eons of its presence there. The stone did not merely reside at Vormir. It had reorganized the planet around the terms of its own acquisition. The Soul Stone required a sacrifice. The sacrifice had to be genuine, not merely costly, but irreversible, a willingness to give up the thing of greatest value without the possibility of reclamation. This requirement was not arbitrary. It was the nature of the Soul Stone itself, which governed the realm of souls and recognized the specific weight of a soul deliberately surrendered. The stone would not be taken. It would only be given. And the giving required a price that could not be paid by anyone who had nothing to lose. Red Skull had been transported to Vormir by the Tesseract when it absorbed him on the Valkyrie. The transportation was not death and not life as he had known it. He arrived at the cliff where the Soul Stone waited and found himself bound to it as its guardian and herald, unable to take it himself because the sacrifice required for its acquisition was one he was constitutionally incapable of making. He had loved nothing except his own ambition, and ambition is not the currency Vormir accepted. He remained there for 70 years, alone with the stone and the steady grey sky and the sound of the wind across the mountain's edge. A punishment that had the quality of mythological proportion, and that Schmidt himself would not have described as unjust if asked directly, because his own framework had always contained within it the acknowledgement that power had costs. When Romanoff and Barton arrived, each of them understood the terms immediately. Each of them attempted to pay the price in the other's place. What followed? The struggle on the cliff's edge between two people who both wanted to be the one who fell for the same reason, which was that neither could bear to be the one who remained, was one of the quietest catastrophes in the timeline's record. No weapons, no alien armies, no scale sufficient to attract documentary coverage. Two people, a cliff, and the irreversible grammar of sacrifice. Romanoff fell. Barton returned with the stone and the specific quality of grief that belongs to people who survived by losing something they would not have chosen to keep at that price. The conversation about Wanda Maximoff requires a context that the immediate sequence of her most visible actions tends to obscure. She was, before anything else happened to her, a child in Sokovia who grew up in the particular conditions that the intersection of post-war poverty and Cold War proxy politics produced in Eastern European nations limited material resources, significant political instability, a background radiation of institutional distrust that informed every relationship her generation formed with any authority larger than the immediate family. The Mind Stone enhancement did not create chaos magic in her. The serum Erskine developed did not create courage in Rogers, and the Mind Stone did not create the power that it accessed in Wanda. It activated what was already there, latent in her specific genetic configuration, possibly for generations, a capacity for reality manipulation that had been waiting for a sufficient trigger, the way certain seeds wait for a specific temperature. She was already extraordinary before the stone. The stone simply made that fact visible. The years between the enhancement and Westview were years of learning a power without a teacher, without anyone who understood what she was capable of, or what the management of it required. Vision had offered companionship and a form of understanding, because Vision himself occupied a unique position between machine and consciousness and genuine emotional complexity, and the space they had found together had the specific warmth of things built without guarantee of duration. When Vision died, the first time, with the Mind Stone removed from his forehead by Wanda's own hands because the alternative was worse, she lost the only person who had been specifically capable of understanding her. The grief that followed was not simply emotional. For someone whose emotions directly interface with the fabric of reality, grief at sufficient concentration was structural. Westview was not a choice, in the sense that most consequential decisions are choices. It was a happening, her power expressing the thing she most needed before her conscious mind had time to intervene. The hex sprang from her the way water springs from a vessel that has exceeded its capacity. The version of Wanda that emerged from Westview, who took the Darkhold, who read it while the grief was still raw, was not the same person who had arrived. The book did not introduce the corruption. The book recognized what was there and organized it. The Scarlet Witch, the identity the Darkhold named, was not a mask Wanda put on. It was a reflection that the book held up to someone who was already standing at the edge of a very specific kind of transformation. The Scarlet Witch's actions in the multiverse had the quality of someone solving a problem with tools whose secondary effects she had stopped including in her calculations. She was not unaware of the damage. She was beyond caring about it, which is not the same state as ignorance. It is further along the same road, past the point where caring could generate effective resistance. Only her children's fear stopped her, the fear of a stranger in their mother's face, a mirror no one had thought to hold in front of her, was the only thing capable of crossing the distance the Darkhold had helped her travel from herself. She brought the mountain down. Whether she survived it, the record does not confirm. The door was left open. Of all the individuals whose biographies intersect with Thanos, Nebula's account carries a particular texture because it was the most thoroughly documented from the inside. She was present for more of Thanos' working process than anyone except Gamora, and she was modified by it in ways that were not merely psychological, but architectural. Thanos had acquired Nebula as a child from a world he culled, and had subsequently used her as the material for a project he framed as improvement. Each time she lost a fight, to Gamora primarily, in the competitive structure Thanos maintained between them, he removed a component of her organic body and replaced it with a mechanical one. The framing was improvement. The practice was replacement. Piece by piece, across years of combat and loss, Nebula became more machine and less whatever she had been originally. She arrived at adulthood carrying less of her original body than most beings carry, of their original beliefs, and what she had instead was an engineering precision and a fury at the gap between what she'd been told she was and what she'd been made into. Her eventual movement toward the Guardians, never fully comfortable, never entirely trusted, always slightly outside the warmth that the group generated collectively, was the movement of someone who had been taught that connections were liabilities and was learning, slowly and without a teacher, that this lesson was the most expensive thing Thanos had ever taken from her. She was not soft. The years had not produced softness. They had produced a capacity for endurance that softness would not have survived, and under that endurance, something she had not been permitted to name. The alternate timeline version of Nebula, the one whose neural link to her present-day self facilitated 2014 Thanos' arrival in the present, died in the aftermath of that arrival, shot by the Nebula who had become something different across the intervening years. The 2014 Nebula was where she had been then, without the 5 years of accumulated change. The present-day Nebula was where that change had arrived. The confrontation between them was, in the most direct possible sense, a confrontation between who she had been and who she had become, and present-day Nebula fired without hesitating. She went back to the Guardians afterward and did not discuss what she had done. The Guardians did not ask. Loki's history is the history of a person who discovered that the foundation of their identity was constructed rather than given, and then spent the subsequent years testing every possible response to that discovery: denial, overcorrection, cynicism, performance, genuine transformation, and, eventually, something approaching acceptance. The discovery in Asgard's vault that the blue colouring of his skin under a frost giant's touch was not aberration but origin, was not merely biographical information. It was the disassembly of every status he had built. He had been competing with Thor for the approval of a father and a court, not understanding that the competition was rigged from the moment it began. Not because Odin preferred Thor necessarily, but because Loki's position in the court had always carried an asterisk that no one had disclosed. He was the son of Asgard's defeated enemy, raised in Asgard's palace, given every advantage of that upbringing, and then systematically denied the knowledge that would have allowed him to contextualize what those advantages had cost him. The subsequent years were organized around reinvention, because reinvention was the only strategy available to someone whose original identity had been discovered to be provisional. He reinvented himself as a villain, because villainy at least had clear parameters and did not require the continuous disappointment of attempting to belong somewhere that had always known more about him than it disclosed. He reinvented himself as a trickster, as a mercenary, as an anti-hero, as a quasi-ally, as the king who had escaped every death the universe had arranged for him. the death on the Infinity War's transport ship, Thanos' hands around his throat in the wreckage of the Asgardian vessel, was different from the previous deaths in one significant way. It was genuine. Loki had attempted something real. He had tried to kill Thanos in defense of Thor, knowing the probability distribution of the attempt with clarity, and had attempted it anyway. The attempt failed, but the attempt was the thing. It was not a performance. The alternate timeline Loki who escaped with the Tesseract in 2012. The version who entered the TVA and discovered the concept of the sacred timeline, and the full account of his own variance and eventual growth, represented something Loki had never had before: access to the future that had not yet been determined. What that version chose to do with the knowledge of who he could become was the most genuinely consequential choice in Loki's long catalogue of choices, because it was the first one made without an audience and with full information. He died at the end of time, holding a timeline he had chosen to sacrifice himself for, rather than a performance of a character he no longer needed to maintain. The multiverse remained open. His sacrifice held one thread. The other threads moved beyond anyone's current capacity to count. The Black Order, Corvus Glaive, Proxima Midnight, Ebony Maw, and Cull Obsidian were not simply soldiers. They were the outer architecture of Thanos' project, the force that the Infinity War deployed against the universe's defenses before Thanos arrived to personally acquire what the defenses had been protecting. Ebony Maw operated as something between herald and torturer, a figure of genuinely considerable intelligence whose primary gift was persuasion, at the point of a threat so absolute that persuasion and coercion became difficult to distinguish. He arrived in New York during the Infinity War with a philosophy rather than simply a mission, and attempted to convert Strange rather than simply extract the stone from him, because Maw genuinely believed, or had been organized to believe, that what Thanos was doing was correct, and that sufficiently intelligent people would recognize it as correct if presented with the argument rather than merely the force. Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive operated as a unit in the way that a weapon and its wielder operate as a unit. Distributed capability, functionally inseparable, each one multiplied by the proximity of the other. They fell in Wakanda during the final engagement before Thanos arrived to complete the gauntlet. The record does not indicate that their deaths changed Thanos' calculations in any direction. Cull Obsidian was the application of force at its simplest, brought to bear in situations where the complexity of the other three was not required. He fell early in Wakanda. Gamora and Nebula occupy a different section of this history, not because their relationship to Thanos was meaningfully different in form, but because their relationship to it was different in consequence. They were not the Black Order. They were something Thanos had called children and treated as instruments, and the gap between those two characterizations was the gap in which both of them, separately and across years of irreconcilable experience, had eventually found their way to different alignments entirely. The generation that had grown up in the shadow of the Avengers, and more specifically in the shadow of the Blip, the 5 years of absence and the 5 years of reintegration that followed, was beginning to produce its own figures of consequence, Cassie Lang had grown 5 years in her father's absence, and had returned to find him 5 years younger than she expected, and with no frame of reference for what his absence had actually meant to her. She carried the particular gap that the blip produced in families separated across the temporal divide, the asymmetry of experience, the impossibility of shared reference for a period that each party had lived completely differently. She had also been developing, in the years of her father's work as Ant-Man, and through her proximity to Hank Pym's technology, an increasingly precise understanding of the quantum realm that had produced the mapping device which would eventually send the Lang and Pym family into it involuntarily. Tommy and Billy Maximoff, created within the hex, dissolved with it, and then existing somewhere in the multiverse's branching structure in a form that Wanda's Darkhold search had confirmed as genuinely present rather than merely theorized, represented a thread of consequence that the timeline had not yet resolved. The twins that the hex produced had been real in every sense that mattered. They had laughed and learned and called for their mother. Whatever version of them existed in the multiverse's branches carried whatever of that reality the branches preserved. And Wanda had destroyed every Darkhold to prevent herself from pursuing them. But Wanda was under the mountain, and the mountain's verdict was not the final word. America Chavez, now somewhere between the Sanctum's tutelage and the full development of her multiverse punching capacity, represented the most literally unprecedented power set in the timeline's record. She could not be explained by any established category. She was not an enhanced human, not a mutant in any recognized classification, not a product of any known technological or mystical program. She punched through the walls between universes with her bare fists, and the stars that accompanied that punching were a signature in the multiverse's fabric that functioned as a calling card visible to anyone specifically looking for it. Several forces were beginning to look. Eli Bradley, Kate Bishop, Tommy and Billy, America, Cassie. The generation below the Avengers was not yet a team. They were not yet fully aware of each other's existence. They were simply the next instances of a pattern that the Marvel Universe had been running since the first Celestial seeded the first world. The emergence, in each generation, of the people the next crisis would require. The multiverse was not a metaphor. It was not a theoretical construct. It was the actual architecture of existence, a branching, expanding structure of parallel timelines, each containing a complete and internally consistent version of reality, running simultaneously, separated by dimensional barriers that had been designed by He Who Remains, with the specific purpose of preventing what was now beginning to occur. The incursion problem, two timelines occupying the same space, pressing against each other until one or both were destroyed, was not a theoretical worst case. It was the documented outcome of what happened when the boundaries between parallel realities were compromised. He Who Remains had understood this because his variants had demonstrated it. A multiversal war fought across every branch, each variant of the same individual attempting to dominate or destroy all others. The dimensional barriers sustaining damage across every front simultaneously until the accumulated damage reached the threshold of total collapse. He Who Remains had stopped that war by collapsing the multiverse to a single thread. The sacred timeline. One version of events, carefully maintained, with every deviation pruned before it could establish itself as an independent timeline with its own internal logic and its own version of the same individuals who existed on the main branch. Sylvie's knife had ended that maintenance. The branches were growing. The variants were converging. The version of Kang that he who remains had been keeping off the board, the Council of Kangs, and the specific variant that had been exiled to the quantum realm and defeated there, was now a calculation that the multiverse's expanding structure would eventually have to resolve. The incursion was coming, not as an event with a specific date and a specific moment of impact. It was coming as a condition, a progressive narrowing of the margin between timelines, a slow accumulation of dimensional pressure that would eventually produce the structural failure that he who remains had spent his entire existence preventing. The people who would be positioned to respond to it were not yet assembled. The information they would need was not yet compiled. The universe was breathing, as it always did, with a particular quality of something aware of what is assembling at its edges and continuing anyway, because continuation is what the universe does. T'Challa's decision to open Wakanda to the world at the film of the UN presentation was not, by Wakanda's internal standards, a minor political adjustment. It was the conclusion of a debate that had been running in some form since the nation's founding. The tension between the protective concealment that had allowed Wakanda to survive and the accumulated responsibility that an advanced civilization with resources the world desperately needed had been deferring indefinitely. The debate had crystallized most sharply in the confrontation with Eric Killmonger, Njadaka, the son of Prince Njobu, who had grown up in Oakland without a country after T'Chaka killed his father to prevent the disclosure of Wakanda's secrets, and left the boy without apparent ceremony or provision in a world that would subsequently shape him into someone with both the motivation and the means to challenge the throne. Killmonger's argument was not simply that Wakanda should intervene in the oppression of black people globally. It was that Wakanda had been complicit in that oppression by choosing not to. That the concealment was not merely protective, but, from a certain angle, collaborative with the forces that found Wakanda's absence convenient. T'Challa heard the argument and fought the man who made it and won, and then spent the subsequent period sitting with the part of the argument he could not defeat by winning the fight. The answer to it, as he delivered it to the UN, was not Killmonger's answer. Killmonger's answer had been force and dominance. T'Challa's answer was something harder to sustain. Openness without conquest, sharing without subjugation, the specific generosity of power that does not require the recipient to be grateful for the terms. The Wakandan outreach centers that T'Challa began establishing, in Oakland specifically, where his cousin had grown up without a country, were the physical form of this answer. They were also the acknowledgement, quiet and without ceremony, of what had been owed for a long time. The immediate physics of the snap, the dissolution of half of all living beings in the universe simultaneously, received the most attention in the timeline's record for obvious reasons. The second-order effects received less, and they were considerable. Economic infrastructure built around specific population densities collapsed in regions where the dissolution had concentrated. Agricultural systems dependent on specific numbers of workers failed, not in the visible sudden way of a disaster, but in the slow grinding way of systems operating below their minimum viable threshold. Harvest not brought in, supply chains with missing nodes, distribution networks with too many gaps for the remainder to compensate. The first year after the snap was, in several regions of the world, a famine year, and the record of those years tends to be buried under the narrative weight of the superheroic response because human suffering at mass scale is harder to represent than the suffering of specific individuals with names and faces. Children were half-orphaned on a scale that no foster system was organized to manage. Children were fully orphaned. Some children dissolved and left behind adults who had been their parents, and who then lived, in the subsequent 5 years, with the specific grief of loss, without a body and without a grave. Loss that had been observed, that had a specific moment attached to it, but that could not be processed through any of the ritual frameworks that human cultures had developed for managing the fact of death, because death had not occurred in any way the frameworks recognized. The return of the Blip, 5 years later, simultaneous, undifferentiated, was not simply joyous. It was a second disruption. Housing that had been redistributed was now contested. Legal status that had shifted in the intervening years required renegotiation. Marriages that had ended, children that had been born, estates that had been settled. All of these were now problems without obvious solutions, pressing against legal frameworks that had been built for a world where people disappeared one at a time with process and documentation, rather than half at once in an instant. The generation that had lived through both disruptions and spent 5 years in the gap carried that experience the way generations carry their defining conditions, not as a historical event they could step back from and evaluate with perspective, but as the substrate of their assumptions, the weather their understanding of the world had formed in. They were not the same as the generation before the snap, and they were not the same as the Blip who returned. They were the generation shaped by the living through, and they were just now reaching the ages at which that shaping would begin to determine what they did with it. The CIA, MI6, the GRU, the Mossad, and every equivalent organization with any operational sophistication had been maintaining files on enhanced individuals since the first confirmed reports of the super soldier program, and those files had grown substantially after New York, after the Battle of Sokovia, after every subsequent event that added to the publicly available evidence of superhuman capability operating in the world. The fundamental tension in every intelligence community's approach to this information was the same tension that defined Fury's position from the start. Enhanced individuals were simultaneously the most significant assets available and the most significant threats available. And the line between those two categories was determined entirely by alignment, which was in turn determined by factors that conventional intelligence methodologies were not designed to predict. A surveillance state sophisticated enough to identify enhanced individuals before they fully developed their capabilities was also, by design, a surveillance state that could be turned against those individuals once identified. The registration debate that formed the nominal center of the Civil War conflict was also, beneath the political surface, this debate: who controlled the list? Romanoff's data dump after the Hydra revelation. Every SHIELD file, every Hydra file, every record accumulated across 70 years of institutional intelligence, released to the public simultaneously through an act of deliberate transparency that she understood would end her operational career and potentially several careers adjacent to it, was the most radical answer to the question of who controls the list. The answer she gave was, everyone, which is the same as saying no one has the list as a weapon, which is the same as saying the weapon is gone. The consequences of that dump were not uniformly positive. Assets were burned. Ongoing operations were compromised. People whose identities had been protected by the classification were exposed. Romanoff had calculated these costs and concluded that they were smaller than the cost of the information remaining in the hands of an institution that had been proved to be compromised at its foundations. She was right. She was also responsible for a specific category of damage that the rightness of her larger conclusion did not eliminate. The accounting of consequences that the Marvel Universe's record contains is incomplete by design and necessity. Incomplete by design because no accounting of living history can claim totality while the history continues, and by necessity because the forces now in motion exceed any single perspective's capacity to hold simultaneously. The SHIELD moves through the air above training grounds in Louisiana, in the hands of someone who accepted the inheritance not as a gift, but as a responsibility, a distinction that makes all the difference in what the symbol becomes when it lands. Sam Wilson carries it with the full awareness of what the symbol meant before he held it, and what it will mean because he holds it. And those two things are in productive tension rather than false resolution. The tension is the work. The sorcerers maintain the sanctums with the same daily diligence they have maintained them for centuries, augmented now by a strange who carries a third eye as a reminder of the price of carelessness with power at this scale, and who navigates the branching multiverse with the equipment of someone who can see possible futures and the temperament of someone who has learned, at significant cost, the difference between seeing and controlling. In Wakanda, Shuri builds. The grief that she metabolized across the events of Wakanda's recent years has been converted into the same energy that all Wakandan grief eventually becomes. Forward motion, directed precision, the application of intelligence and will to the problem of what comes next. The grief did not disappear. It became the fuel, which is the only thing grief at sufficient depth ever reliably becomes. The quantum realm remains accessible, and its temporal properties remain understood by a small number of people with the capability to use them. The responsibility that understanding creates, the specific weight of knowing that time, at some scale, can be navigated, has not yet been formalized into any institution or protocol. It persists as private knowledge in private hands, waiting for the moment when the need is sufficient and the cost is clear and someone is willing to pay it. The multiverse branches. Every branching creates new versions of the decisions already made. New Tonys who did not solve the time heist. New Rogers who chose differently in the ice. New Wanders who did not find the Darkhold. New Lokis who did not fall from the Bifrost. Every branch is complete. Every branch is real. The full dimensional weight of every choice ever made by every significant person in the timeline exists simultaneously, pressing against the barriers that he who remains designed and that are no longer being maintained. What is approaching is not a single event. It is a condition, the accumulated consequence of a multiverse that has been allowed to branch freely for the first time in an age, combined with the specific varieties of threat that free branching produces. The incursion, the variance, the inheritance of every action taken under the assumption that actions have a single timeline of consequence. The people who will meet it are still being shaped by the events that precede it. They carry the tools and the wounds and the histories and the alliances and the fractures that this account has tried, with appropriate patience and without undue haste to trace. They will not be ready. The universe has never waited for readiness. It has simply arrived with the steadiness that catastrophe and renewal share, and the people in its path have made of it what they could. The universe breathes, the branches grow. In the space between one chapter and the next, the world persists, inhabited, imperfect, full of people who have chosen again and again to face forward. That has always been enough to begin.